Sometimes the hardest lesson a teacher learns doesn't come from textbooks, it comes from a child's broken heart. When Dr. Eli Ramsey moved to a quiet mountain town to teach elementary school, he thought he was escaping his own painful past. But on a grey October afternoon, two 6-year-old twins stayed after class. With tears in their eyes, they made a plea that would change everything. "If you're so smart, make our mom better." Their mother is lost to addiction. Their home is falling apart. These children are watching their world crumble, just like Eli did as a boy. He knows he can't fix their mother with science or theories, but maybe he can give them what no one gave him: someone who doesn't give up. The question is, can a man who spent his life running from his own broken childhood really save a family that's already shattered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains surrounding Pine Ridge held secrets in their shadows, and Dr. Eli Ramsey had come here to bury his own among them. 3 years ago, he'd walked away from a prestigious neuroscience lab at Johns Hopkins, trading microscopes and grant proposals for chalk dust and picture books. The transition from studying synapses to teaching syllables hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. His apartment above Murphy's hardware store was sparsely few books, a coffee maker that worked most mornings, and a desk where he graded papers by lamplight. The only photograph sat face down in the top drawer, hidden beneath lesson plans and red pens. Some ghosts were better left undisturbed. Pine Ridge Elementary sat at the end of Maple Street, like a faded postcard from simpler times. Built in 1952, the brick building housed just 8 classrooms and 200 students whose families had roots deeper than the ancient pines that gave the town its name. Principal Margaret Chen had hired Eli sight unseen, desperate for a qualified teacher willing to work for small-town wages. "Most folks here have never met a real doctor," she'd told him during his phone interview. "You'll be quite the curiosity." That curiosity had faded into acceptance over 3 years of parent-teacher conferences and school plays. The parents of Pine Ridge trusted him with their children's futures, never knowing he'd once mapped the neural pathways of memory formation, never suspecting the irony that a man who understood how memories were made spent his days trying to forget his own. Room 14 smelled of apple juice and construction paper. 22 first graders filled the tiny desks, their legs swinging freely above linoleum floors worn smooth by decades of small feet. Eli had arranged the room carefully reading corner with soft cushions, science station with magnifying glasses and shells, art supplies organized in clear containers where small hands could reach them. The morning routine never varied. Circle time at 8:30, where they shared weekend adventures and lost teeth. Reading groups after snack, math centers before lunch. The predictability soothed him as much as it did the children. Structure was safety, routine was refuge. Among his students, Wren and Jonah Blackwood sat like matched bookends in the back row. At 6 years old, they possessed an otherworldly stillness that set them apart from their chattering classmates. Wren, with her dark hair perpetually braided too tightly, clutched a worn stuffed rabbit during story time. Jonah, slight and pale, chewed his pencil erasers down to metal nubs and rarely spoke above a whisper. The twins had been in his class since September, and Eli had learned to read their subtle communications the way Wren would touch her brother's hand when thunder rumbled outside. How Jonah would slide his sister his apple slices when she forgot her lunch again. They were raising each other, these little ones, in ways that made Eli's chest tighten with recognition. Their mother, Mara Blackwood, was a ghost at school events. While other parents crowded into the small gymnasium for the Christmas program or lingered after conferences to discuss reading levels, Mara remained absent. The few times Eli had glimpsed her dropping the twins off late, picking them up with hands that shook slightly, she'd reminded him of a bird with a broken wing, beautiful but unable to fly. "She used to paint," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the kindergarten teacher, during lunch duty one day. "Had a little studio downtown before the twins were born." made the most beautiful landscapes. You could almost feel the mountain air in them. Such a shame what happened after their father left. The stories came in fragments, as small-town stories often did. Mara Blackwood had been the artistic soul of Pine Ridge, painting murals on the sides of buildings and teaching art classes at the community center. When her husband abandoned the family 2 years ago, taking the car and half their savings, something inside her had broken beyond repair. The bottle became her comfort, and the twins learned to fend for themselves. Eli recognized the signs because he'd lived them, the way Wren hoarded snacks in her backpack, saving them for later, when food might not come. How Jonah startled at sudden noises, his small body tensing like a spring wound too tight. The careful way they moved through the world, hyper-aware of adult moods and voices, ready to disappear at the first sign of trouble. In his desk drawer, beside lesson plans and emergency contact forms, Eli kept a small notebook where he documented concerns. October 3rd. Wren fell asleep during math centers. October 8th. Jonah wore the same shirt 4 days in a row. October 15th. Both children late again. Wren's braid coming undone, both wearing shoes too small for their feet. The notebook was evidence of failing, but evidence he couldn't act upon without proof. Suspicion wasn't enough to save children. He'd learned that lesson long ago in another life, with another mother, in another town that had failed to protect the vulnerable. During recess, while other children played tag or swung from monkey bars, the twins would sit together under the old oak tree at the playground's edge. Wren would whisper stories to her brother, elaborate tales of flying horses and magical kingdoms where children lived in castles and never went hungry. Jonah would nod solemnly, adding details about brave knights and wise queens who kept everyone safe. Eli often found excuses to pass by their tree, pretending to supervise while actually listening to their innocent fantasies. Their stories revealed their deepest wishes, safety, abundance, adults who could be trusted. The dreams of children who understood too much about the world's capacity for cruelty. One afternoon in late October, he'd noticed Wren drawing during free time. Her crayon moved carefully across the paper, creating a house with a red door and yellow windows. 3 stick figures stood in front too, small ones holding hands, one taller figure with long hair flowing like water. Above the house, she'd drawn what might have been the sun, but the way she'd colored it, pressing the yellow crayon until it tore the paper, suggested something more desperate here, wish burning too bright. "That's a beautiful family," Eli had said, kneeling beside her desk. Wren's eyes had filled with tears. She was too young to hide. "It's pretend," she'd whispered. "The mommy in my picture isn't sad all the time." That drawing now lived in Eli's desk drawer, beside his notebook of concerns and a research journal he'd carried from his old life. The journal contained his real work years of neural mapping studies, findings about addiction and brain chemistry that had once seemed like the key to understanding human suffering. Now it felt like ancient history, academic theories that couldn't touch the reality of 2 children who needed their mother to remember how to love them. The October afternoon that would change everything started like any other. Reading groups had finished, math centers were complete, and the children were gathering their backpacks for dismissal. Bus riders lined up at the door, while parent pickup students sat quietly at their desks, waiting for familiar faces to appear in the hallway windows. One by one, the children left. Sarah's grandmother with her kind smile and peppermint smell. Tommy's mother still wearing her nurse scrubs from the clinic. Mrs. Park collecting her 3 grandchildren, speaking to them in gentle Korean mixed with English. Soon, only Wren and Jonah remained, sitting at their desks with backpacks in their laps, watching the door with the stillness of old souls. This wasn't unusual. Mara was often late, sometimes very late. Eli had learned to keep crackers in his desk and picture books, ready for these waiting periods. But today felt different. The twins sat more rigidly than usual, their small hands gripping their backpack straps like lifelines. When 4 o'clock came and went, then 4:30, Eli saw something shift in their expressions. Hope dimming to resignation, resignation settling into a familiar despair that no 6-year-old should ever have to master. At 5 o'clock, when the custodian began turning off lights in the empty hallways, Wren finally spoke. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "could we talk to you about something important?" Eli set down his red pen and gave them his full attention. In 3 years of teaching, he'd learned that when children asked for important conversations, they usually were. Jonas slipped from his chair and moved to stand beside his sister, their small bodies pressed together for courage. Wren reached into her backpack and pulled out a piece of paper knot, the family drawing from weeks before, but something new. This drawing showed the same house, the same 3 figures, but now dark scribbles covered the mother figure, angry marks that nearly obscured her shape. "We made this for you," Wren said, placing the paper on Eli's desk with shaking hands. "Because you're really smart, and you used to be a doctor before you became our teacher, and we thought maybe you could help us fix something that's broken." Jonah stepped forward then, his voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of a desperate prayer. "If you're so smart, make our mum better." The words hung in the air like fragile things, and Eli felt something crack open in his Chester place he'd kept carefully sealed since coming to Pine Ridge. These children were asking him to do what no doctor, no scientist, no amount of knowledge had ever been able to accomplish. They were asking him to heal a broken heart, to mend a shattered soul, to bring back a mother who was lost in her own darkness. In his desk drawer, beneath the lesson plans and the notebook of concerns, lay his old research journal. Pages and pages of data about neural pathways and chemical dependencies, years of work trying to understand the biology of addiction. All of it useless in the face of 2 children who just wanted their mother to remember how to love them. But as he looked into their hopeful, terrified eyes, Eli realized that maybe his knowledge wasn't the point. Maybe what these children needed wasn't a doctor or a scientist. Maybe they just needed someone who wouldn't give up on their family, someone who understood that healing sometimes happened one day, one moment, one act of stubborn love at a time. "Tell me about your mom," he said gently, moving his chair closer to their desks. "Help me understand what's happening at home." The twins' words settled over the empty classroom like dust after an explosion. Eli looked at their drawing, the mother figure, obscured by angry scribbles, the house that should have been a home, looking more like a prison. His hands felt suddenly heavy, weighted with the enormity of what these children were asking him to do. "Tell me about your mom," he said again, his voice gentler now. "What happens at home that makes you worry?" Wren glanced at her brother, some silent communication passing between them. They'd perfected this wordless language, these two, speaking in glances and touches the way children do when words become dangerous. "She sleeps a lot during the day," Wren finally said. "And sometimes she cries at night when she thinks we can't hear her." Jonah nodded, adding his own piece to the puzzle. "She forgets to make dinner sometimes, and she has bottles that she hides, but we know where they are. The bottles make her different." Wren continued, her small hands twisting the straps of her backpack. "Like she's there, but not really there. Like she's looking at us, but seeing something else." Eli's throat tightened. These children had learned to decode their mother's moods, to navigate the unpredictable landscape of addiction with the survival instincts of much older souls. It was a skill no 6-year-old should ever need to develop. "Sometimes she tries to paint," Jonah whispered. "She gets out her brushes and the colors, and for a little while she looks like she used to look in the pictures, but then she gets sad and puts everything away." "What pictures?" Eli asked. "From before," Wren said. "When Daddy still lived with us and Mama smiled all the time. She had paintings everywhere, on the walls, on the porch, even on the fence posts. Daddy used to say she could paint the sunrise so real you'd think morning was breaking right there in our living room." The image formed in Eli's mind, a house filled with color and light, a mother who saw beauty in the world and captured it for her children to see. What must it feel like to lose that vision, to watch the colors drain away until only gray remained? "Where is your mom now?" he asked. "Do you know if she's coming to pick you up?" The twins exchanged another look, this one heavier with knowledge they wished they didn't possess. "She's probably sleeping," Wren said. "She sleeps a lot after she drinks from the bottles. We know how to walk home by ourselves." Eli's chest tightened. The walk from school to their house was nearly 2 miles, most of it along the winding mountain road where cars took the curves too fast. He'd driven that route himself countless times, seen how the afternoon shadows fell across the asphalt, creating blind spots that could hide small bodies until it was too late. "I think I should drive you home today," he said, making the decision as he spoke. "Make sure you get there safely." "You don't have to do that," Jonas said quickly, the automatic response of a child who'd learned not to be a burden. "We're good walkers." "I know you are," Eli replied, "but it would make me feel better to know you got home okay. Is that all right with you?" The relief that flooded their faces told him everything he needed to know about how alone these children felt in the world. They gathered their things while Eli locked up the classroom, his mind already racing ahead to what he might find at the Blackwood house. The drive took 15 minutes along roads that climbed steadily into the foothills. The twins sat quietly in his back seat, occasionally pointing out landmarks, the creek where they'd seen a deer last spring, the old barn where someone had painted a mural of wildflowers that was slowly fading in the mountain weather. Their house sat at the end of a gravel drive, a small cabin that might once have been charming, but now sagged under the weight of neglect. The porch steps were rotting, the paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the October wind. But Eli could see traces of the beauty it had once held: chimes made from pieces of colored glass, flower boxes that still held the dried remains of summer petals, a front door painted the same cheerful red as in Wren's drawing. "That's Mama's studio," Wren said, pointing to a small outbuilding behind the house. "She used to paint out there every morning. She said the light was perfect when the sun came over the mountain." Eli parked beside a rusted pickup truck and walked the twins to their front door. The windows were dark, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. When Wren tried the handle, it was locked. "Mama must be sleeping really deep," she said, reaching under a flower pot for a hidden key. The casual way she performed this routine told Eli it wasn't the first time they'd come home to a locked house and an absent mother. The key turned easily, and the door swung open to reveal a living room frozen in mid-destruction. Couch cushions lay scattered on the floor, their covers stained with substances Eli didn't want to identify. Empty bottle swine, beer, something stronger created a glass graveyard on the coffee table. The air smelled of stale alcohol and something else, something sweet and sick that made his stomach turn. "Mama?" Wren called softly. "We're home." No answer came from the darkened hallway that led to what Eli assumed were the bedrooms. The twins moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, Jonah gathering bottles while Wren straightened cushions, both of them cleaning up their mother's mess with the weary competence of children who'd done this many times before. "You don't have to do that," Eli said, but Wren shook her head. "She gets upset when the house is messy," she explained. "And when she's upset, she drinks more from the bottles." It was then that Eli saw it propped against the wall near the kitchen, half hidden behind an overturned chair. An easel held a canvas, and on that canvas was the beginning of something beautiful. Mountains at sunrise, painted in colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with life. But the painting was unfinished, the brushstrokes ending abruptly, as if the artist had simply stopped mid-thought, overwhelmed by the beauty she was trying to capture. Mara's unfinished painting was like looking at a soul interrupted, a creative spirit crying out through addiction's fog. The mountains glowed with golden light, and in the foreground, barely sketched but unmistakably present, were 2 small figures holding hands. Her children, waiting for her to finish bringing them into the light. A sound from the hallway made them all freeze a groan, followed by the shuffle of unsteady footsteps. Mara Blackwood appeared in the doorway like a ghost of herself, thin and pale in clothes that hung too loose on her frame. Her dark hair, so like Wren's, fell in tangles around a face that might have been beautiful before sorrow and alcohol carved lines too deep for her 32 years. "Who's in my house?" she slurred, squinting at Eli, as if he were an apparition she couldn't quite bring into focus. "Mama, this is Mr. Ramsey," Wren said quickly, moving to stand between her mother and her teacher. "He's our teacher. He brought us home." Mara's eyes struggled to focus, moving from Eli to her children and back again. When she saw the cleaned living room, something like shame flickered across her features. "I was just resting," she said, her words thick and careful. "Had a headache. I was going to come get you." "It's okay, Mama," Jonas said, his small voice carrying the weight of forgiveness no child should have to offer. "Mr. Ramsey didn't mind driving us." Eli watched this interaction with growing horror and heartbreak. These children were parenting their parent, offering comfort and understanding to someone who should have been caring for them. The role reversal was complete and devastating. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said gently, "I'm Eli Ramsey, the twins' teacher. They're wonderful children. They were worried about you today." Mara's gaze sharpened slightly, some maternal instinct cutting through the haze. "Worried? Why were they worried?" "You were supposed to pick us up," Wren said quietly. "We waited until 5 o'clock." The shame that crossed Mara's face was raw and painful to witness. She looked at her children as if seeing them clearly for the first time in months, and Eli watched her remember, for just a moment, who she used to be. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words seemed to tear something inside her chest. "I'm so sorry, babies. Mama's been having a hard time lately." She swayed slightly, catching herself on the doorframe. Eli stepped forward instinctively, but Wren was already there, steadying her mother with small hands that had learned to be strong. "It's okay, Mama," Wren said. "Mr. Ramsey's really smart. Maybe he can help us figure out how to make things better." Mara's eyes met Eli's then, and in them he saw everything, the love she still felt for her children, the shame that was eating her alive, the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, someone could throw her a lifeline before she drowned completely. "I don't think anyone can help me," she said, but her voice held a question mark, a tiny opening in the wall she'd built around her pain. Eli looked at the unfinished painting, at the two children who'd asked him to fix their broken world, at a mother who was disappearing one bottle at a time. He thought of his research, his understanding of addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing. He thought of his own mother and the help that had come too late. "Maybe we could try," he said. The drive back to his apartment felt longer than usual, Eli's mind replaying every detail of what he'd witnessed at the Blackwood house. The image of Mara swaying in her doorway, the twins' automatic response to clean up their mother's mess. The unfinished painting that spoke of dreams interrupted all of it, churned in his chest like a physical weight. He climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment, his legs heavy with the day's revelations. Inside, the familiar sparseness felt different now, almost sterile compared to the chaotic love and loss he'd seen in that small cabin. He made coffee he didn't want and sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers that needed grading. The assignment seemed trivial now, worksheets about counting by tens, when two children in his class were counting the bottles their mother hid around the house. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of his own childhood home and a mother who'd made similar promises about getting better. He woke at dawn with a headache and a decision forming in his mind like morning mist becoming solid. The next day at school, Eli watched the twins with new eyes. He noticed how Wren carefully divided her snack into 2 portions, saving half for later, perhaps for her brother if he ran out. He saw how Jonah's attention drifted during math lessons, his small face wearing the worried expression of a child carrying adult concerns. They were functioning, these resilient little souls, but functioning wasn't the same as thriving. During lunch, while his students ate in the cafeteria, Eli walked down the hall to the main office. Principal Chen looked up from her computer as he knocked on her doorframe. "Eli, come in. You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." Margaret Chen had been principal at Pine Ridge Elementary for 15 years, long enough to develop an intuition about when her teachers needed to talk. She was a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of educator who'd gone into administration not for power, but to better serve children. "It's about the Blackwood twins," Eli said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I'm concerned about their home situation." Margaret's expression grew serious. "I've been wondering when someone would bring this up. What did you observe?" Eli chose his words carefully, walking the line between professional concern and personal involvement. He described the twins' behavior patterns, their frequent tardiness, the signs of neglect he'd documented in his notebook. He mentioned yesterday's late pickup and his decision to drive them home, though he kept the details of what he'd found there deliberately vague. "I've seen similar patterns before," Margaret said when he finished. "The question is, what do we do about it? We can't act on suspicion alone, and sometimes well-meaning intervention makes things worse for the children." "What if we started small?" Eli suggested. "Extra support at school, maybe a breakfast program for the twins, counseling services, ways to help them here while we figure out how to help at home." Margaret nodded slowly. "The district has resources for at-risk students. I could make some calls, see what services we can access." "And Eli?" She studied his face carefully. "I know you have a background in research. Sometimes that analytical mind can be both a blessing and a burden when you're dealing with the messy realities of family dysfunction. Don't try to save everyone." Her words carried the weight of experience, and Eli wondered what other teachers she'd watched burn themselves out trying to fix problems bigger than any one person could handle. But as he walked back to his classroom, he couldn't shake the image of Wren's drawing the mother figure, obscured by angry scribbles, waiting to be redeemed. That afternoon, he kept a closer eye on dismissal time. When 4 o'clock came and went without any sign of Mara, Eli made a decision. Instead of waiting until the building emptied, he approached the twins at 4:15. "Would you like me to call your mom and check if she's on her way?" he asked. The twins exchanged their wordless communication before Wren shook her head. "She doesn't like phone calls during the day. They make her nervous." Another piece of the puzzle. Phone calls triggered anxiety, probably because they often brought bad news, overdue bills, concerned teachers, worried neighbors. Eli understood the impulse to avoid contact with the outside world when your inside world was falling apart. At 4:30, he made another decision. "How about we work on some art projects while we wait? I have supplies here, and I noticed you both like to draw." He set up paper and crayons at the small table in his reading corner, and the twins settled in with the quiet focus of children accustomed to entertaining themselves. Wren began drawing another house, this one with a garden full of flowers. Jonah created what looked like a map, with winding paths leading from a school building to a cabin in the mountains. "That's the way home," he explained when Eli asked about his drawing. "Sometimes Wren and I pretend we're explorers, and we have to follow the secret paths to get back to our castle." "Is your house a castle?" Eli asked, settling into a child-sized chair beside them. "It could be," Wren said seriously. "If someone fixed the steps and painted the walls and made the windows bright again, Mama says it used to be beautiful, before Daddy left and everything got sad." Her matter-of-fact tone broke Eli's heart. These children had learned to accept sadness as a permanent condition, the way other children accepted seasons or weather. They'd adapted to living in the shadow of their mother's pain, making themselves small enough to fit in the spaces between her grief. At 5 o'clock, Mara's truck pulled into the school parking lot with a grinding of gears that suggested mechanical problems. Through the classroom windows, Eli watched her sit behind the wheel for several minutes, gathering courage or composure, or both. When she finally walked toward the building, her movements were more controlled than yesterday, though he could still see the tremor in her hands. "I'm sorry," were the first words out of her mouth when she reached the classroom. "I lost track of time. I was working on something, and I just lost track of time." "It's no problem," Eli said, helping the twins gather their artwork. "We were having fun with some drawing projects." Mara's eyes fixed on her children's pictures, and something shifted in her expression. "You drew our house," she said to Wren, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she'd forgotten it was possible to see beauty in their home. I made it pretty, Ren explained. Like it could be if we had magic paintbrushes. And I made a map of all the ways to get home. Jonah added, showing his mother the winding paths he'd created. See, there are lots of different roads, but they all lead to the same place. Mara knelt down to study their artwork more closely, and Eli saw tears gathering in her eyes. These are beautiful, she whispered. You both have your mama's artistic eye. It was the first time Eli had heard her speak of herself as their mother rather than as a burden they had to carry. The small shift in language felt significant, a crack in the wall of shame she'd built around herself. They're very talented, Eli agreed. Ren has a wonderful sense of color, and Jonah sees patterns and connections that surprise me. Mara looked up at him then, and he saw gratitude mixed with something else, curiosity, perhaps, or hope. You really think so? I know so, Eli said firmly. They're remarkable children. They get that from somewhere. The compliment landed like a small gift, and Mara straightened slightly, as if remembering she was more than just her worst moments. Thank you, she said quietly, for being patient with them, for being patient with us. As they gathered their things to leave, Mara paused at the door. Mr. Ramsey, if they ever need anything at school, anything at all, will you let me know? I want to do better. I want to be better for them. Of course, Eli said. And Mrs. Blackwood, if you ever want to talk about resources or support services in the community, I'm here to listen. She nodded, not quite ready to take that step, but not closing the door either. As Eli watched them walk to their truck, he noticed something he'd missed before: a small canvas bag slung over Mara's shoulder, the kind artists used to carry supplies. Maybe she really had been working on something when she lost track of time. Maybe the creative spark wasn't completely extinguished after all. Back in his empty classroom, Eli sat down with his notebook and added a new entry. October 20, 3rd, Mara picking up twins. Mentioned working on something, possibly art. Children drew pictures of home with hope rather than despair. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. Then he pulled out his old research journal and flipped to a section he'd marked months ago: studies on art therapy and addiction recovery. Perhaps there was more than one way to approach healing. Perhaps the scientist in him could work alongside the teacher, the caregiver, the man who understood what it meant to wish someone had refused to give up on his own broken family. The old family photograph lived in the back of Eli's desk drawer, buried beneath lesson plans and emergency contact forms, like a secret he wasn't ready to share with the world. 3 figures stood in front of a modest house, not unlike the Blackwood Cabina, younger version of himself, gap-toothed and grinning, flanked by parents who seemed solid and happy in the frozen moment of black and white film. The photo lied, of course. Pictures always did. They captured surfaces, not the undercurrents that pulled families apart. His father's smile masked the frustration of a man watching his wife disappear into her own private darkness. His mother's embrace, so warm and protective in the image, had become increasingly rare in the months after the photo was taken. Eli hadn't looked at the picture in over a year, but finding it now felt like unearthing a time capsule. He was 7 in the foot older than the twins, but not by much. Old enough to remember the before times, when his mother had been fully present, painting watercolor flowers on his bedroom walls and reading him stories in funny voices that made him giggle until his sides hurt. The similarities between his childhood and the twins' situation were impossible to ignore. The slow slide from normalcy to chaos, the gradual understanding that other families didn't live with the constant uncertainty of whether Mom would be herself or someone else entirely. The learned behavior of hypervigilance, always scanning for signs of danger, always ready to become smaller, quieter, less of a burden. But there was one crucial difference. Eli had been alone in his struggle. The twins had each other, and now perhaps they had him. Over the following weeks, he began implementing small changes in his classroom routine. He started each day by checking in with individual students during their morning journal time, using those few minutes to gauge how the twins were doing. He kept a supply of granola bars in his desk, offering them casually during snack time when he noticed the twins' lunchboxes were emptier than usual. Most importantly, he began building a relationship with Mara that went beyond the typical parent-teacher interactions. When she arrived for pickup, he made a point of sharing something positive about the twins' clever answer in math class, a kind gesture toward a classmate, a particularly creative drawing. He watched how she absorbed these small victories, how they seemed to remind her that she was raising good children despite her struggles. Wren helped Jamie tie his shoes today, he told her one afternoon in early November. She's becoming quite the little teacher herself. Mara's face lit up with genuine pride. She's always been nurturing. Even as a tiny baby, she seemed to understand when people needed comfort. Her expression grew wistful. She used to bring me dandelions from the yard, called them sunshine flowers, said they were medicine for sad hearts. It was the most personal thing Mara had shared about her children, and Eli treasured the glimpse into their family's better days. He began to see strategies forming ways to remind Mara of her strength as a mother, to help her reconnect with the woman she'd been before addiction rewrote her story. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when the twins were working on a science project about animal habitats. Jonah had grown frustrated trying to draw a beaver dam, crumpling up several attempts before pushing the paper away with tears in his eyes. "I can't make it look right," he said, his small voice thick with defeat. "It's supposed to look like the picture in the book, but mine just looks stupid." Eli knelt beside the boy's desk, studying the crumpled drawings. They showed real artistic instinct, careful attention to detail, an understanding of how shapes fit together to create something larger. The problem wasn't ability, it was confidence. "Your mum is an artist," Eli said quietly. "Did you know that talent often runs in families?" Jonah looked up with surprise. "Mama doesn't paint anymore." "But she used to, and she was very good at it. I bet she could give you some tips about drawing if you asked her." The seed of an idea was planted. That afternoon, when Mara came for pickup, Eli mentioned Jonah's artistic struggle and suggested she might help him with the project at home. "I don't know," Mara said, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I haven't painted in so long. I'm not sure I remember how." "It's like riding a bicycle," Eli said gently. "The skill doesn't disappear, even when we stop using it for a while." The next morning, Jonah arrived at school with a completed beaver dam, drawing that was remarkable in its detail and creativity. But more than that, he arrived with stories. "Mama helped me," he told Eli excitedly during morning circle time. "She showed me how to make the sticks look round instead of flat, and how to add shadows so they look real. And guess what? She started painting again while we worked. Just a little painting of a bird, but it was so pretty." The news hit Eli like a small miracle. Mara had picked up a brush again. She'd remembered, for one evening at least, who she used to be. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Pine Ridge. By the end of the week, other parents were talking about Mara Blackwood's return to art. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store mentioned seeing her buying art supplies for the first time in 2 years. Tom Martinez, who owned the hardware store, said she'd asked about easels and canvases, her eyes brighter than he'd seen them since before her husband left. The attention was a double-edged sword. Small towns had long memories, and not all of them were forgiving. Some residents whispered about second chances and redemption. Others muttered about leopards and spots, convinced that people like Mara didn't really change. Eli found himself becoming protective in ways that surprised him. When he overheard gossip in Murphy's hardware store speculation about Mara's sobriety and fitness as a mother, he found himself intervening with carefully chosen words about the twins' progress in school and their obvious love for their mother. "Those children are lucky to have such a devoted teacher," Mrs. Murphy said after one such conversation. "Not everyone would go to such lengths for their students." But Eli was beginning to understand that his motivations weren't entirely altruistic. Helping the Blackwood family was also helping himself, allowing him to face the ghosts he'd been running from for 3 years. Every small victory in their healing journey felt like a victory over his own past, a chance to rewrite the ending of a story that had haunted him since childhood. The evening he decided to visit their home again. He told himself it was purely professional, a follow-up to check on Jonah's continued progress with his art projects. But as he drove the winding mountain road with a bag of art supplies in his passenger seat, he knew he was crossing a line from teacher to something more complicated. The Blackwood house looked different in the golden light of late afternoon. Someone had swept the porch and replaced the broken step with a piece of plywood that, while not pretty, was functional. Wind chimes made from pieces of colored glass caught the breeze, their gentle music a stark contrast to the silence that had greeted him weeks before. Mara answered the door, wearing clothes that fit properly and hair that had been brushed. Her eyes were clearer than he'd seen them, though dark circles underneath spoke of the ongoing battle she was fighting. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything all right? Did something happen at school?" "Everything's fine," he assured her quickly. "I brought some additional art supplies for Jonah's project, and I was hoping to see how his drawing skills are developing." It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. But Mara stepped aside to let him enter, and he found himself in a living room that had been transformed. The bottles were gone, the furniture arranged properly, and on an easel near the window sat a small canvas depicting a mountain meadow filled with wildflowers. The painting was exquisite, not just technically proficient, but emotionally resonant. It captured the way morning light fell across the peaks behind Pine Ridge, the particular shade of purple that lupines turned in the mountain air. It was the work of someone who saw beauty in the world and had the skill to translate that vision into something others could share. "Mama's been painting every day," Wren announced proudly, running to hug Eli's legs. "She made that one yesterday, and she says she's going to make one of our house next, but pretty like it used to be." "It's beautiful," Eli said, meaning it completely. "You haven't lost your touch at all." Mara's cheeks flushed with pleasure and embarrassment. "It feels strange, picking up a brush again, like I'm meeting an old friend I haven't seen in years." "The best kind of reunion," Eli said, studying the painting more closely. "Have you thought about showing your work again? I know the community center has wall space for local artists." "Oh, I couldn't," Mara said quickly. "I'm not ready for that. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for that." But Eli could see the longing in her eyes, the part of her that missed being seen as more than just her struggles. As he watched her interact with her children helping Jonah with his drawing, listening to Wren's elaborate stories about magical kingdom, she began to understand that recovery wasn't just about putting down the bottle. It was about picking up the pieces of the person you used to be and figuring out how to put them back together in a new configuration. The crumpled AA meeting schedule fell out of Mara's purse while she was looking for her car keys, landing on Eli's classroom floor like a small admission of defeat. She snatched it up quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but not before Eli caught a glimpse of the times and locations penciled in the margins meetings she'd circled, meetings she'd crossed out, a paper trail of good intentions that had never quite translated into action. "I keep meaning to go," she said quietly, stuffing the schedule back into her purse with shaking hands. "I've driven to the community center 3 times this month, sat in the parking lot, just never made it through the door." It was mid-November now, 6 weeks since that first afternoon when the twins had asked him to fix their mother. In that time, Eli had watched Mara make remarkable progress days when she was clear-eyed and present, evenings when she painted with the focused intensity of someone rediscovering their purpose. But he'd also seen the setbacks, the mornings when she arrived late to pick up the twins with the telltale signs of a difficult night written across her face. Recovery, he was learning, wasn't a straight line. It was more like the mountain roads around Pine Ridge, full of curves and switchbacks, moments of clarity followed by steep descents into familiar darkness. "Would it help if you had someone to go with you?" he asked carefully. "Sometimes the first step is the hardest one to take alone." Mara looked at him with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You would do that? Go to a meeting with me?" "I would," Eli said, meaning it completely, "if you think it would help." The truth was, He'd been researching treatment options for weeks, diving back into the scientific literature he'd once lived in. His apartment now contained stacks of printouts about addiction medicine, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the neurological changes that occurred during recovery. But all the research in the world couldn't replace the simple act of showing up for someone who was struggling. They agreed to attend the Thursday evening meeting at the community center. Eli arrived early, parking near the back of the lot where he could see Mara's truck when she arrived. At 7:15, just when he was beginning to worry she'd changed her mind, he saw her vehicle pull in slowly, hesitating before finding a parking spot. She sat in her truck for several minutes, gathering courage the way some people gathered their belongings. When she finally emerged, she moved like someone walking toward the edge of a cliff-edge step, deliberate and potentially final. "I'm nervous," she admitted when they met at the entrance to the community center. "What if someone recognizes me? What if they judge me for taking so long to get help?" "Then they'll have forgotten what it felt like to be in your shoes," Eli said. "Anyone who's been where you are will understand that getting here at all is an act of courage." The meeting was held in the same room where the town held holiday parties and school board meetings. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, industrial carpet that had seen better decades, fluorescent lights that cast everything in slightly harsh relief. About 15 people had gathered, ranging in age from barely out of high school to well into retirement. Some looked like they'd been attending these meetings for years. Others carried the same nervous energy that radiated from Mara. When it came time for introductions, Mara's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm Mara, and I'm an alcoholic." The words seemed to surprise her as she spoke them, as if hearing herself say them out loud made them more real than they'd been in the privacy of her own mind. Eli watched her throughout the meeting, saw how she absorbed the stories shared by other tales of loss and recovery, of families rebuilt and careers salvaged, the daily choice to keep choosing sobriety even when it felt impossible. When the meeting ended, she lingered in her chair while others filed out, as if reluctant to leave this space where her struggle had a name and a community. "How do you feel?" Eli asked as they walked to their cars. "Terrified," she said honestly, "but also relieved, like maybe I'm not the only person who's made such a mess of things." "You're definitely not the only one," Eli assured her. "And Mara, what you did tonight, admitting you need help that took more strength than you know." She began attending meetings regularly after that, and Eli could see the change in her interactions with the twins. She was more present during their after-school conversations, more engaged when they showed her their schoolwork, quicker to laugh at their silly jokes and stories. But recovery brought its own challenges. As Mara's mind cleared from the fog of constant drinking, she began to truly see what her addiction had cost her children. The guilt was overwhelming nights when she'd passed out while they made their own dinner, mornings when they'd gotten themselves ready for school because she couldn't get out of bed. The countless small moments of childhood she'd missed while lost in her own pain. "I keep thinking about all the things I didn't do," she told Eli one evening after a particularly emotional AA meeting. "Ren lost her first tooth 3 months ago, and I don't even remember it happening. What kind of mother doesn't remember her child losing her first tooth?" "The kind of mother who was sick," Eli said gently. "The kind of mother who's getting better now, who's here for all the teeth that come after." But the guilt was a dangerous companion, threatening to pull her back toward the very substances she was working so hard to avoid. Eli watched her struggle with the weight of her regrets, saw how some days the shame made her want to disappear again rather than face what she'd done. The crisis came on a Tuesday in late November. Snow had begun falling early that morning, coating the mountain roads in a treacherous layer of white. Eli was grading papers when his phone rang, the school's main number displaying on the screen. "Eli, it's Margaret. I just got a call from social services. Someone reported concerns about the Blackwood children, possible neglect, inadequate supervision. They want to conduct an interview tomorrow." Eli's blood went cold. "Who reported it?" "They wouldn't say, but it doesn't matter now. What matters is that Mrs. Hendricks from Child Protective Services will be here at 10 a.m. to speak with the twins, and she'll want to visit their home afterward." After hanging up, Eli sat staring at the phone, his mind racing. Someone in Pine Ridge had decided that Mara's efforts weren't enough, that her children would be better off somewhere else. The thought of Ren and Jonah being separated from their mother, especially now, when she was fighting so hard to get better, made his chest tight with panic. He drove to the Blackwood house that evening, finding Mara in her studio working on a new painting. This one was different from her previous landscapes, darker, more abstract, with swirling colors that suggested storms and turbulence. She was painting her emotional state, he realized, working through her fears and frustrations on canvas. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his voice made her set down her brush immediately. When he explained about the social services visit, Mara's face went white. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as the magnitude of the situation hit her. "They're going to take them away," she whispered. "They're going to look at this house, at me, and they're going to decide I'm not fit to be their mother." "That's not necessarily true," Eli said, though his own fear made the words sound hollow. "You've been sober for 3 weeks, you're attending meetings, the house is clean, the children are well cared for." 3 weeks, Mara laughed bitterly. 3 weeks against 2 years of being the worst mother in the world. Do you think that's going to matter to them? Eli knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were paint-stained and cold, the hands of an artist who was rediscovering her craft, even as her world threatened to fall apart. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You are not the worst mother in the world. You're a mother who got sick, and you're a mother who's getting better. Ren and Jonah know that. I know that. Tomorrow, we're going to show Mrs. Hendricks that too." "How?" Mara asked, tears streaming down her face. "How do I prove that I'm worth keeping my children?" "By being exactly who you are right now," Eli said. "The mother who helps with homework, who paints with her son, who's fighting every day to be present in their lives. The mother who was brave enough to ask for help." That night, Eli stayed at the Blackwood house, helping Mara prepare for the visit. They organized documented AA attendance records, the twins' improved school reports, medical records showing she was seeking treatment. More importantly, they talked about what she would say, how she would present her story not as a tale of failure, but as one of recovery. "What if it's not enough?" Mara asked, as they sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. "Then we fight," Eli said. "We get you a lawyer, we present evidence of your progress, we show them that these children belong with their mother." "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you risking so much to help us?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, thinking of the photograph in his desk drawer, of the mother he'd lost to addiction when he was not much older than the twins. "Because everyone deserves someone who doesn't give up on them," he said finally. "Because your children asked me to help, and I'm not ready to tell them I can't." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, Eli helped Mara practice what she would say to the social worker. But more than that, he helped her remember who she was, beyond her mistakes, a mother who loved her children enough to fight for them, an artist who was learning to see beauty in the world again, a woman who had stumbled but was finding her footing once more. The real test would come in a few hours, when a stranger would arrive to judge whether their small, imperfect, healing family was worth preserving. The death certificate was yellow with age, creased from years of being folded and unfolded, carried from apartment to apartment like a talisman of grief. Eli's mother's name, Sarah Elizabeth Ramsey, was printed in neat typewriter font, followed by the clinical details of her final day. Cause of death: acute alcohol poisoning. Age: 34. Survived by one son, age 10. Eli hadn't looked at the document in over a year, but Mrs. Hendricks's questions that morning had dredged up memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. The social worker had been thorough but not unkind, interviewing the twins separately about their home life, asking careful questions about meals and bedtimes and whether they ever felt scared or unsafe. "Mr. Ramsey," she'd said after speaking with the children, "the twins speak very highly of you. They seem to see you as a protective figure in their lives. Can you tell me about your relationship with this family?" He'd chosen his words carefully, describing his role as their teacher, his concern for their well-being, his observations of Mara's efforts to get clean. But Mrs. Hendricks was experienced at reading between the lines. This level of involvement is unusual for a teacher, she'd noted. What motivates you to go to such lengths for these children? That's when the memories had started flooding back his own childhood spent walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of his mother would greet him when he came home from school. The way she'd promised to get better, swear she'd stop drinking, hold his face in her hands, and pledge to be the mother he deserved. And then, the inevitable relapse, the cycle repeating until it ended, in a hospital room where machines beeped steadily and his mother never woke up. Now, sitting in his apartment after the longest day of his life, Eli held the death certificate and wondered if he was trying to save the Blackwood family, or if he was trying to save the 10-year-old boy who'd lost his mother to a disease no one understood well enough to cure. The visit to the Blackwood house had gone better than expected. Mrs. Hendricks had found a clean, organized home where 2 children were clearly loved and cared for. She'd seen Mara's artwork, evidence of a creative spirit emerging from darkness. She'd observed the family's interaction during lunch-wren, chattering about her day at school, Jonah showing his mother a drawing he'd made, Mara listening with the focused attention of someone making up for lost time. Mrs. Blackwood appears to be making genuine efforts toward recovery. Mrs. Hendricks had said as she prepared to leave. However, I will need to file a report and there will be follow-up visits. The children's safety remains our primary concern. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it wasn't over either. The family would remain under scrutiny, their progress monitored by strangers who would judge their fitness by standards that didn't account for the messy reality of healing. That evening, Eli had returned to the Blackwood house to find Mara in her studio, furiously painting what looked like a storm over the mountains. Her brush moved in angry strokes, creating dark clouds that seemed to boil with unspoken rage. I can't do this, she'd said without looking up from her canvas. I can't live knowing that someone is always watching, waiting for me to mess up. Maybe they're right. Maybe the twins would be better off with a family that doesn't come with so much baggage. That's the addiction talking, Eli had said. That voice that tells you you're not worth fighting for. You know it's lying. But Mara had shaken her head, tears mixing with paint on her palette. What if it's not lying? What if I'm fooling myself thinking I can be the mother they deserve? Then you're fooling me too, Eli had replied. And you're fooling your children, who love you exactly as you are. He'd stayed until the twins were asleep, talking Mara through her fears, reminding her of how far she'd come. But driving home, he'd felt the weight of his own doubts settling over him like the November darkness. Was he helping this family heal, or was he projecting his own unresolved grief onto their situation? The phone call came at 11 p.m., jarring him from restless sleep. Mara's voice was thick with tears, and something else, the slurred words that meant she'd been drinking. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into the phone. "I'm so sorry, Eli. I tried. I really tried, but it hurt so much, and I just wanted it to stop hurting for a little while." Eli's heart sank. After 3 weeks of sobriety, after the progress she'd made, after everything they'd worked toward, she'd relapsed. The stress of the social services visit, the fear of losing her children, the overwhelming guilt of her past mistakes had finally broken through her defenses. "Where are the twins?" he asked, already reaching for his keys. "Asleep," she said. "They don't know. I waited until they were asleep. I'm not completely terrible." "You're not terrible at all," Eli said, heading for his car. "You're sick and you had a setback. I'm coming over." "No," Mara said quickly. "You can't. If someone sees you there, if Mrs. Hendricks finds out, it'll make everything worse. They'll definitely take the twins away." She was right, and they both knew it. His presence at her house during a relapse would only confirm suspicions that the family was dysfunctional, that the children were at risk. But the thought of leaving her alone with her demons, with access to whatever alcohol she'd found, made his stomach turn. "Promise me you'll stop drinking tonight," he said. "Promise me you'll call your sponsor." "I don't know if I can stop," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," Eli said firmly. "You've proven that already. This is just one night, Mara, one setback in a longer journey. It doesn't erase everything you've accomplished. After hanging up, Eli sat in his car in the parking lot behind Murphy's Hardware, staring at his phone and debating whether to call Margaret Chen or Mrs. Hendricks or someone else who might know what to do when recovery stumbled. But in the end, he drove home and spent the night pacing his apartment, checking his phone every few minutes for messages that didn't come. The next morning, Ren and Jonah arrived at school on time, clean and fed, and apparently unaware of their mother's struggles the night before. But Eli could see the telltale signs in their behavior, the way they sat closer together than usual, the worried glances they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. Children always knew, even when adults tried to protect them from the truth. When Mara came for pickup that afternoon, she looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, her hands shaking as she signed the twins out of after-school care. She met Eli's gaze briefly, and in her expression he saw shame so profound it was almost physical. "We need to talk," he said quietly, and she nodded. After the twins were buckled into their car seats, Mara lingered by his classroom door. "I called my sponsor," she said without looking at him. "Went to an emergency meeting this morning, started my count over." "Good," Eli said. "That's what recovery looks like, not perfection, but getting back up when you fall." "Mrs. Hendricks is going to find out," Mara said. "Someone will tell her, or she'll see it in my face, or—" "Maybe," Eli agreed. "But maybe not, and even if she does, that doesn't mean it's over. It means you have to work harder to prove that this was a setback, not a surrender." As he watched her drive away with the twins, Eli thought about the death certificate in his desk drawer, about the promise he'd made to children who'd asked him to fix their broken world. His mother had relapsed too, many times, before the final one that took her away forever. But maybe, just maybe, Mara's story could have a different ending. The question was whether he was strong enough to help write it, and whether his own unhealed wounds would allow him to see the difference between saving the Blackwood family and trying to resurrect the dead. The medical emergency bracelet was silver, tarnished with age, hidden beneath a pile of unpaid bills in Mara's kitchen drawer. Eli discovered it by accident while helping her organize paperwork for her second meeting with Mrs. Hendricks, who had indeed learned about the relapse through Pine Ridge's efficient gossip network. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the bracelet. The engraving was partially worn away, but he could make out the words, "Mara Blackwood, epileptic, emergency contact," followed by a phone number that had been disconnected years ago. Mara looked up from the documents they'd been sorting, and her face went white. "I forgot I still had that," she said quickly, reaching for the bracelet. "It's old, from before the twins were born." But Eli had spent too many years in medical research to dismiss the significance of what he was holding. "Mara, are you telling me you have epilepsy? Are you taking medication for it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mara sank into her kitchen chair, her hands trembling in a way that suddenly seemed less like withdrawal and more like something else entirely. "I was diagnosed when I was 19, she said quietly. "Started having seizures in college. The medication worked well for years, but after the twins were born, everything got so expensive. When David left and took the insurance with him, I had to choose between groceries and prescriptions." Eli felt the world shift around him, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known he was solving, suddenly clicking into place. "How long have you been off your medication?" "About 18 months, Mara admitted. "I know it was stupid, but the seizures weren't happening very often, and the kids needed so many things." "Mara," Eli interrupted, his voice urgent with understanding. "Alcohol withdrawal can trigger seizures in people with epilepsy, and alcohol itself can interfere with seizure medications even when you are taking them. This isn't just addiction, this is a medical emergency that's been going on for over a year." The implications crashed over him like a wave. The trembling hands he'd attributed to drinking, the confusion and disorientation that seemed worse than simple hangovers. The desperate return to alcohol whenever she tried to quit, not just psychological dependence, but her brain's terrified response to withdrawal that could literally kill her. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell your doctor, or your sponsor, or me?" Mara's eyes filled with tears. Because I was ashamed. Because I knew it was my fault for stopping the medication. Because I thought if people knew I had epilepsy on top of everything else, they'd definitely take the twins away. Who wants their children raised by someone who could have a seizure at any moment? Eli knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Someone who's getting proper medical treatment. That's who. Mara, epilepsy is manageable with the right medication and monitoring. But trying to detox from alcohol without medical supervision when you have a seizure disorder, that's incredibly dangerous. He thought of all the meetings where she'd blamed herself for her inability to stay sober. All the nights she'd called herself weak for giving in to cravings that were actually her brain's desperate attempt to prevent seizures. The guilt she'd carried, the shame that had kept her isolated from help, the belief that she was simply a bad person with no willpower. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said, "today. Not next week, not when it's convenient today. I can't afford—" "There are programs," Eli said, his mind already racing through the medical resources he remembered from his research days. Community health centers, sliding fee scales, emergency Medicaid. "We'll figure out the money later. Right now, we need to make sure you're safe." The drive to the county health clinic took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads. Eli had called ahead, explaining the situation to a triage nurse who agreed to work them in despite the packed schedule. Mara sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching the old medical bracelet like a lifeline. "I'm scared," she said as they pulled into the clinic parking lot. "What if they say it's too late? What if the damage is already done?" "Then we deal with that," Eli said. "But Mara, for the first time since I've known you, we're going to be dealing with facts instead of assumptions. We're going to know what we're fighting." Dr. Patricia Gonzalez was a small woman with grey-streaked hair and the matter-of-fact demeanor of someone who'd spent 20 years treating patients who couldn't afford to see specialists. She listened to Mara's history without judgment, asking precise questions about seizure frequency, alcohol consumption, and the timeline of her symptoms. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said after completing her examination, "you've been in a medically dangerous situation for months. Alcohol withdrawal can be fatal for someone with your seizure history, especially without proper medication management." "So I really am sick?" Mara asked, and there was something like relief in her voice. "It's not just weakness, it's not just me being a terrible person. You have a medical condition that's been inadequately treated," Dr. Gonzalez said firmly. "Addiction is also a medical condition, not a moral failing. What you've been experiencing is your brain's attempt to self-medicate in the absence of proper treatment." She prescribed anti-seizure medication and connected Mara with a social worker who could help navigate insurance options and payment plans. More importantly, she referred them to a treatment program that specialized in dual diagnosis patients dealing with both addiction and underlying medical conditions. "This changes everything about your recovery plan," Dr. Gonzalez explained. "Medical detox under supervision, medication management, counseling that addresses both the addiction and the seizure disorder. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be medically sound." Driving home, Mara was quiet for a long time, processing the reframing of her entire struggle. Finally, she spoke. "All this time I thought I was just weak," she said. "Every time I couldn't stay sober, every time I gave in to the craving, I told myself I was a failure as a mother, as a person. But my brain was literally trying to keep me alive." "That doesn't mean the addiction isn't real," Eli said carefully. "Both things can be true. You have a medical condition that makes recovery more complicated, and you still need to do the work of staying sober, but now we can do it safely, with proper support." "What about Mrs. Hendricks? What about the investigation?" Eli had been thinking about that during the entire drive. This is actually good news for the case. It shows that you weren't just a parent who chose drinking over her children. You were a parent with an untreated medical condition who was trying to manage an impossible situation. It demonstrates that with proper medical care, your prognosis is completely different. When they arrived at the Blackwood house, the twins were waiting on the porch, having been dropped off by their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, after school. They ran to their mother, chattering about their day, oblivious to the medical revelation that had reframed their entire family's story. "Did you have a good appointment?" Ren asked, noticing the pharmacy bag in Mara's hand. "Yes, sweetheart," Mara said, kneeling to hug both children. "Mama found out that she's been sick in a way that doctors can help fix. I'm going to take some medicine that will make me feel much better." "Like vitamins?" Jonah asked. "Sort of like vitamins," Mara agreed. "Medicine that helps my brain work the way it's supposed to." That evening, Eli helped Mara organize her new medications and understand the treatment plan Dr. Gonzalez had outlined. They also worked on a letter for Mrs. Hendricks, documenting the medical discoveries and the new treatment approach. "I keep thinking about all the meetings where I talked about powerlessness," Mara said as they worked. "I thought I was powerless over alcohol. But really, I was powerless over an untreated medical condition. Now that we know what we're dealing with now, I have some power back." "Knowledge is power," Eli agreed. "And proper medical treatment is power. And having people who support you, that's power too." As he prepared to leave that night, Mara caught his arm. "Eli, why did you look through that drawer? What made you notice the bracelet?" He considered the question, thinking about the research journal in his own desk drawer, the years he'd spent studying addiction and brain chemistry. "Maybe because I've spent so long trying to understand why some people recover and others don't," he said. "Maybe because I knew there had to be missing pieces to your story. What if we'd never found it? What if I'd kept trying to get sober without knowing about the seizure disorder?" Eli didn't want to answer that question directly, but they both knew the statistics. People with untreated dual diagnoses had significantly lower recovery rates and much higher risk of fatal complications during withdrawal. "But we did find it," he said instead, "and now everything changes." For the first time in months, Mara smiled with something that looked like genuine hope. The fight wasn't over, if anything, it was just beginning. But now they were fighting the right battle, with the right weapons, and for the first time, Eli believed they might actually win. The custody papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, delivered by a process server who apologized for the timing as he handed them to Mara at her front door. The legal language was dense and cold, but the message was clear. The state was petitioning for temporary custody of Ren and Jonah Blackwood, citing concerns about parental fitness and child welfare. Eli was grading papers when his phone rang, Mara's number flashing on the screen. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but he could hear the brittleness underneath, like ice over deep water. "They're really going to try to take them," she said. "The hearing is scheduled for December 18th, 3 days before Christmas." The timing felt deliberate, designed to maximize emotional impact. Eli set down his red pen and gave her his full attention. "What does your lawyer say?" "I don't have a lawyer yet. The legal aid office said they can assign someone, but they're overwhelmed with cases. I might not meet with anyone until the day before the hearing." Eli closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything they'd worked toward Mara's medical treatment, her progress in recovery, the family's slow healing now, hung in the balance of a legal system that moved by its own logic and timeline. "We need to change that," he said. "You need proper representation, someone who understands dual diagnosis, someone who can present your medical situation as evidence of recovery rather than additional liability." That afternoon, Eli made a decision that would either save the Blackwood family or destroy his own career. He called Dr. Patricia Gonzalez at the county clinic, asking for detailed medical records and a professional assessment of Mara's progress. He contacted the director of the Dual Diagnosis Treatment Program, requesting documentation of Mara's participation and prognosis. Most significantly, he used connections from his former research career to reach out to Dr. Sarah Kim, an addiction specialist at the State University, who'd published extensively on dual diagnosis cases. "You're asking me to serve as an expert witness in a custody case," Dr. Kim said during their phone conversation. "That's a significant commitment. What's your relationship to this family?" Eli had been dreading this question, knowing his answer would determine whether Dr. Kim would help or politely decline. "I'm the children's teacher, But more than that, I'm someone who believes this family can heal with proper support. And you have medical background yourself. I was a neuroscientist before I became a teacher. I understand the research on addiction and seizure disorders. I know what Mara has been fighting, and I've seen what she's capable of when she has proper medical treatment. Dr. Kim was quiet for a long moment. Send me her medical records and treatment documentation. If the science supports your assessment, I'll consider testifying on her behalf. But understand, I won't compromise my professional integrity for anyone. I wouldn't ask you to, Eli said. I'm only asking you to look at the evidence and draw your own conclusions. While he worked to assemble Mara's legal defense, the emotional toll on the twins became increasingly apparent. They'd overheard enough adult conversations to understand that something serious was happening, and their behavior at school reflected their anxiety. Ren stopped eating lunch, picking at her food, while staring out the window. Jonah began having nightmares, waking up crying for his mother in the middle of nap time. Are we going to have to go live somewhere else? Ren asked him one afternoon during reading time, her voice small and scared. Eli knelt beside her desk, choosing his words carefully. Some grown-ups are worried about you and your brother, and they want to make sure you're safe and happy. Your mama is working very hard to show them that home is the best place for you to be. But what if they don't believe her? Jonah asked, joining the conversation with the worried expression that had become his default. Then we keep fighting, Eli said. Sometimes when people don't understand a situation, you have to help them learn. That's what we're going to do. The twins nodded with the solemn acceptance of children who'd learned too young that adult decisions could reshape their world without warning. But that evening, Eli found himself staring at his reflection in his bathroom mirror, wondering if he was making promises he couldn't keep. His apartment had become a war room of sorts, legal documents and medical reports covering every surface. He'd taken vacation days to research case law, to interview character witnesses, to coordinate with Mara's new lawyer David Chen, Margaret's nephew, who specialized in family law and had agreed to take the case at a reduced rate. The medical discovery is our strongest asset, David explained during a strategy meeting at the Blackwood house. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't simply choosing alcohol over her children, she was managing an untreated medical condition in the absence of proper health care. That fundamentally changes the narrative. But she still relapsed, Eli pointed out, even after starting treatment. How do we address that? We present it as part of the medical reality, David said. Seizure disorders can cause breakthrough symptoms even with medication. Her relapse occurred during a period of extreme stress, which is a known trigger for seizures. We show that she immediately returned to treatment and has been compliant since then. Mara sat quietly during most of these discussions, overwhelmed by the legal machinery that had mobilized around her family's crisis. She'd been sober for 3 weeks since starting her seizure medication, attending both AA meetings and medical appointments with the dedication of someone fighting for her life. I never imagined it would come to this, she said after David left that evening. When I first started drinking, I told myself it was just to get through the hard days. I never thought I'd end up in court fighting to keep my children. Addiction is a progressive disease, Eli said gently. But so is recovery. Every day you choose sobriety, you're building evidence of your commitment to healing. The week before the hearing, Pine Ridge's small community began choosing sides in ways that surprised everyone. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd been watching the twins after school, wrote a letter describing Mara's transformation over recent months. Tom Martinez, from the hardware store, testified about her sobriety and her renewed interest in art supplies. Even Principal Chen, despite her professional caution, provided documentation of the twins' improved school performance and emotional stability. But support came with opposition. Anonymous complaints had been filed about noise from the Blackwood house complaints that turned out to be unfounded but created additional paperwork. Someone had called the school questioning Eli's unusual interest in the family, forcing Margaret to document their professional relationship and his exemplary record as a teacher. People are scared, Margaret explained when she called to warn him about the complaints. When families fall apart, it reminds everyone how fragile their own situations are. Some folks deal with that fear by finding someone to blame. The night before the hearing, Eli couldn't sleep. He walked the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, past houses where families slept peacefully, not knowing their neighbor's fate would be decided in a few hours. He found himself at the elementary school, using his key to enter the empty building and sit in his classroom where this all began. The twins' artwork still decorated the walls, drawings of houses and families, maps of imaginary kingdoms, portraits of the people they loved. On his desk, he kept the latest drawing Wren had made, a family of 3 standing in front of a house with a bright red door. But now there was a fourth figure, a man, with kind eyes who stood slightly apart, but was clearly part of the group. "That's you," she'd explained, when she gave it to him. "You're in our family picture now because you helped us stay together." The drawing was evidence of how much he'd invested in this outcome, how much his own healing had become intertwined with theirs. If he lost them tomorrow, the system decided that love and effort weren't enough to overcome past mistakes. He wasn't sure how he'd recover from the failure. His phone buzzed. A text from Mara. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about everything that could go wrong tomorrow." He typed back, "Think about everything that could go right. Think about Christmas morning with your children in your own home. What if the judge doesn't believe we've changed? Then we'll prove it by continuing to change every day until everyone can see it." "I'm scared, Eli." "Me too. But we're scared together, and that's better than being scared alone." The morning of December 18th dawned clear and cold, with the kind of mountain sunshine that made everything look possible. Eli arrived at the courthouse early, finding Mara and David Chen in the parking lot, going over last-minute details. Mara wore the navy dress she'd bought for the occasion, her hair pulled back in a style that made her look professional and maternal at the same time. Her hands shook slightly, whether from nerves or medication side effects. Eli couldn't tell, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Whatever happens today," she said, "I want you to know that you saved my life. Maybe not in the way we originally hoped, but you helped me remember who I am underneath all the pain." "We're not at the ending yet," Eli reminded her. "Today is just another chapter." As they walked toward the courthouse steps, Eli thought about the journey that had brought them here from, 2 frightened children, asking their teacher to fix their broken world, to a community rallying around a family fighting to stay together. Win or lose, they'd proven that healing was possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with anger but with stubborn, persistent love. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the quiet efficiency of legal proceedings. Other families waited on wooden benches, some reuniting joyfully, others saying tearful goodbyes. Eli watched Mara's face as she observed these scenes, seeing her steel herself for whatever the next few hours would bring. "Mrs. Blackwood?" A bailiff approached them. "Judge Morrison is ready for you." As they filed into the courtroom, Eli caught sight of Mrs. Hendricks, sitting with the state's attorney, thick folders of documentation spread before them. On their side of the room, David Chen arranged his own papers with careful precision, while Dr. Kim settled into the witness area, her professional demeanor radiating quiet confidence. But it was the small section reserved for family that made Eli's chest tighten with emotion. Margaret Chen sat in the front row, despite the potential professional risks of publicly supporting Mara's case. Mrs. Patterson was there too, clutching a folder of photographs, showing the twins happy and healthy in their mother's care. Tom Martinez had closed his hardware store for the morning, wearing his only suit and carrying a letter of character reference he'd written by hand. The courtroom itself was smaller than Eli had expected, wood-paneled and formal, but not intimidating. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 50s with grey hair and reading glasses, reviewed the case files with the methodical attention of someone who understood that her decisions would reshape lives. "This is a custody hearing regarding Wren and Jonah Blackwood," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "The state has petitioned for temporary custody based on concerns about parental fitness and child safety." Mrs. Blackwood, through her attorney, disputes these claims and seeks to retain custody of her children. David Chen rose for his opening statement, and Eli held his breath, knowing that the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that followed. "Your Honor," David began, "this case represents a fundamental question about the nature of addiction, medical treatment, and second chances. Mrs. Mara Blackwood is not the neglectful parent portrayed in the state's petition. She is a mother with an undiagnosed and untreated medical condition who has spent the last 2 months courageously addressing her health issues and rebuilding her family." He outlined Mara's medical history, her recent diagnosis with epilepsy, and the dangerous cycle of self-medication that had masqueraded as simple addiction. He presented her treatment compliance, her sobriety milestones, and the dramatic improvements in her children's well-being since she'd begun receiving proper medical care. "The state would have you believe that Mrs. Blackwood chose alcohol over her children," David continued. "But the medical evidence shows a woman whose brain was literally trying to prevent seizures in the absence of proper medication. Now that she has appropriate medical treatment, she has demonstrated her commitment to recovery and her competence as a parent." The state's attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Hayes, presented a more familiar narrative. Failed promises of sobriety, missed pickup times, evidence of drinking while responsible for minor children. He acknowledged Mara's recent medical discoveries, but argued that 2 months of progress couldn't erase 2 years of neglect. "Addiction may be a disease, Your Honor, but it's a disease that endangered these children repeatedly. Good intentions and medical explanations don't change the fact that Wren and Jonah Blackwood have been living in an unstable environment where their basic needs were sometimes unmet." As the morning progressed, witnesses took the stand to paint competing pictures of the Blackwood family. Mrs. Hendricks testified about her observations during her visits, acknowledging the improvements she'd seen, but emphasizing her concerns about relapse potential. Dr. Gonzalez explained Mara's medical condition and treatment plan, using clear language to help the judge understand how seizure disorders could complicate addiction recovery. Then Dr. Kim took the stand, and Eli felt the energy in the room shift. Her credentials were impeccable, her research internationally recognized. When she spoke about dual diagnosis cases and the importance of treating underlying medical conditions, her words carried the weight of scientific authority. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Kim testified, "Mrs. Blackwood's case represents a textbook example of how untreated medical conditions can manifest as addiction. Her compliance with seizure medication and her sustained sobriety since beginning proper treatment suggest an excellent prognosis for continued recovery." "But what about her relapse in November?" Hayes asked during cross-examination. "How does that fit with your optimistic assessment?" "Relapse is common in dual diagnosis cases, especially during periods of high stress," Dr. Kim replied calmly. "What's significant is Mrs. Blackwood's immediate return to treatment and her honesty about the incident. Those are indicators of someone committed to recovery, not someone in denial about their condition." The most powerful testimony came from the twins themselves, though they never entered the courtroom. David Chen had arranged for a child psychologist to interview them about their home life, their relationship with their mother, and their feelings about potentially living elsewhere. Both children expressed strong attachment to their mother and their home, the psychologist reported. They demonstrate awareness of their mother's past struggles, but also clear evidence of feeling safe and loved in their current environment. Wren, the older twin, stated that her mother takes her medicine now and doesn't have the sad times as much. Jonah expressed concern about being separated from his sister and asked if Mr. Plust, Ramsey, could visit them if they had to live somewhere else. When Eli's name was mentioned, he felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward him. Judge Morrison made a note on her legal pad, and he wondered what questions might be coming his way. The afternoon session focused on character witnesses. Mrs. Patterson described the changes she'd observed in the family dynamic, the twins' improved behavior, Mara's return to painting. Tom Martinez spoke about her sobriety, her responsibility in paying down old debts, the quiet dignity with which she'd faced the community's judgment. Principal Chen's testimony was particularly impactful. She described the twins' academic and emotional progress, their consistent attendance, their evident happiness when discussing their home life. "In my 15 years as an educator," she concluded, "I've seen many families in crisis. The Blackwood children are not exhibiting the behavioral patterns we typically see in neglected or endangered students. They're thriving children who clearly love and trust their mother." As the day wore on, Eli realized he was holding his breath more often than not, releasing it only when testimony went in Mara's favor. The courtroom had become a crucible where 2 years of pain and 2 months of healing would be weighed against each other, where good intentions would be measured against past failures. When Judge Morrison called for a 30-minute recess before closing arguments, Eli followed Mara and David into the hallway. She leaned against the wall, looking exhausted but determined. "How do you think it's going?" she asked David. "Better than I hoped," he admitted. "The medical testimony was strong, and the character witnesses painted a compelling picture of your recovery, but Hayes made some valid points about your history. It's going to come down to whether Judge Morrison believes people can truly change." "They can," Mara said quietly. "I'm living proof that they can." As they prepared to return to the courtroom for closing arguments, Eli caught Mara's hand. "Whatever happens," he said, "you've already won the most important battle. You chose to fight for your children instead of giving up. You chose to get help instead of hiding. You chose hope over despair. That matters, regardless of what the judge decides." Mara squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for believing in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves." The bailiff called them back into the courtroom, where Judge Morrison would hear final arguments before making a decision that would determine whether 2 children would wake up in their own beds on Christmas morning or begin learning to call someplace else home. The courtroom Bible sat on the witness stand, its black leather cover worn smooth by countless hands that had sworn to tell the truth. When Judge Morrison called Mara Blackwood to testify on her own behalf, the small book seemed to radiate the weight of moral reckoning that would determine a family's fate. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she placed her palm on the Bible and raised her right hand. Her voice was clear when she took the oath, and Eli noticed how she looked directly at the judge when she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. David Chen approached the witness stand with careful steps, knowing that the next few minutes would either save this family or tear it apart forever. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began gently, "please tell the court about your children." For the first time all day, Mara's face transformed completely. The worry lines around her eyes softened, and something bright and fierce sparked in her expression. "Ren and Jonah are the best part of who I am," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Ren has this incredible imagination. She creates whole worlds in her mind and then draws them on paper. She wants to be an artist like her mama, but better," she says. More colorful, Mara's smile was radiant despite her tears. "And Jonah sees patterns everywhere. He can look at a pile of leaves and tell you how they fell from the tree, or watch clouds and predict exactly when it's going to rain. They're brilliant and kind and brave in ways that humble me every single day." "Tell us about your struggles with addiction." The light in Mara's face dimmed, but she didn't look away. "I started drinking after their father left. I told myself it was just to get through the hardest days, just to quiet the voice in my head that said I was failing them. But it became bigger than that. It became the thing I needed to function, and then the thing that kept me from functioning." "Did you understand at the time that you had an underlying medical condition?" "No," Mara said firmly. "I thought I was weak. I thought I was choosing alcohol over my children, and the guilt of that made me drink more. It was a terrible cycle that I couldn't break no matter how hard I tried." David guided her through the medical discovery, her treatment compliance, and the changes in her family life over the past 2 months. With each answer, Mara painted a picture of a woman who had been fighting a battle she didn't fully understand until recently. "Mrs. Blackwood," David said, approaching the heart of his case, "if Judge Morrison allows you to retain custody of your children, what assurances can you give this court that they will be safe and well cared for?" Mara was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of a vow. I can promise that I will take my medication every day, because I know now that my brain needs it to function properly. I can promise that I will continue attending AA meetings and working with my sponsor, because I've learned that recovery is something I have to choose every single day. I can promise that I will keep every medical appointment, every counseling session, every check-in that anyone asks of me. She paused, looking directly at Judge Morrison. But most importantly, I can promise that my children will never again have to wonder if their mother loves them more than she loves a bottle. They will never again have to take care of me instead of me taking care of them. They will never again have to be afraid that I might disappear into my own pain and leave them alone in the world. Her voice broke slightly on the last words, but she continued. I can't promise I'll be a perfect mother, no one can promise that. But I can promise I'll be a present mother, a sober mother, a mother who chooses them every single day for the rest of my life. The courtroom was completely silent when she finished. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the raw honesty of Mara's testimony. Then Robert Hayes stood for cross-examination, and the atmosphere grew tense again. Mrs. Blackwood, he began, you've made promises before, haven't you? To your children, to yourself, to others in your life. How is this promise different from all the ones you've broken? Eli watched Mara absorb the blow, saw how the question hit her like a physical strike. But instead of crumbling, she straightened her shoulders. You're right, she said quietly. I have made promises before that I couldn't keep. But those promises were made by a woman who was trying to fight a medical condition without proper treatment, a woman who was drowning and didn't know why she couldn't swim to shore. And you believe that medical treatment changes everything? I believe that understanding what I was fighting changes everything, Mara replied. I believe that having support changes everything. I believe that choosing to get help instead of trying to handle it alone changes everything. Hayes pressed harder. You relapsed just last month, even after beginning treatment. What guarantee do we have that it won't happen again? You don't, Mara said simply. I can't guarantee that I'll never have another moment of weakness, just like you can't guarantee you'll never catch a cold or get injured in an accident. But I can guarantee that if I stumble, I won't face it alone anymore. I have doctors who understand my condition, sponsors who understand my addiction, and friends who understand my heart. She looked toward the gallery where Eli sat, where the small community that had rallied around her family waited for the judge's decision. I can guarantee that my children will never again have to carry the weight of my illness by themselves. That's the promise I can keep, because it's not a promise I'm making alone anymore. When Mara stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom felt different, somehow charged with the electricity of truth spoken aloud, of a woman who had finally stopped running from her own story and chosen instead to transform it. Judge Morrison's gavel rested beside her right hand like an instrument of fate, its wooden surface worn smooth by decades of decisions that had shaped countless lives. The courtroom held its collective breath as she reviewed her notes one final time, the scratch of her pen across paper, the only sound in the sacred silence. Eli found himself studying her face for any hint of what was coming, but Judge Morrison had perfected the judicial poker face that revealed nothing. In the gallery behind him, he could feel Mara's tension radiating like heat, could sense the small community that had gathered to support her family, leaning forward in anticipation. This court has heard compelling testimony today, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. We've heard about medical conditions, treatment plans, and recovery efforts. We've heard about past failures and recent successes. Most importantly, we've heard about 2 children whose welfare must be our primary concern. She removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Mara, who sat straight-backed beside David Chen, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Blackwood, I want to acknowledge the courage it took for you to testify so honestly about your struggles. Many parents in your situation would minimize their problems or make excuses. Instead, you've taken full responsibility for your actions, while also providing crucial context about your medical condition. Eli felt a flicker of hope at the judge's tone, but he'd sat through enough academic committee meetings to know that positive opening remarks didn't guarantee positive outcomes. However, Judge Morrison continued, and the word fell like a stone into still water, this court must consider not just intentions and promises, but patterns of behavior and realistic assessments of risk. She opened the case file and began reviewing the evidence systematically. The state has documented instances of neglect, missed school pickups, and periods when the children were left to care for themselves. These are serious concerns that cannot be dismissed simply because we now understand their underlying causes. Mara's shoulders sagged slightly, and Eli wanted to reach out and steady her, to remind her that the judge wasn't finished speaking. David Chen must have sensed the same thing, because he placed a reassuring hand on his client's arm. At the same time, Judge Morrison continued, the court has heard compelling evidence of Mrs. Blackwood's recent progress. Her medical treatment compliance, her sobriety milestones, and the improvements in her children's well-being are all significant factors in this decision. She turned to address the state's attorney. Mr. Hayes, your office has done its job in bringing these concerns to the court's attention. Child protection requires vigilance, and sometimes that means making difficult recommendations. However, the evidence presented today suggests that removal of these children from their mother's care would be more traumatic than therapeutic. Robert Hayes nodded professionally, though Eli could see disappointment in his posture. The state's case had been thorough and well presented, but it hadn't accounted for the medical revelations that had reframed everything. Dr. Kim's testimony was particularly compelling, Judge Morrison said, consulting her notes. Her expertise in dual diagnosis cases and her assessment of Mrs. Blackwood's prognosis carries significant weight with this court. When a recognized expert in addiction medicine states that a patient has an excellent chance of sustained recovery with proper treatment, we must take that professional opinion seriously. Eli exchanged a quick glance with Margaret Chen, seeing his own cautious optimism reflected in her face. The judge was building towards something, but they wouldn't know what until she reached her conclusion. The character witnesses painted a picture of a woman who has made significant changes in her life and a community willing to support her continued recovery. Mrs. Patterson's observations about family dynamics, Mr. Martinez's testimony about Mrs. Blackwood's responsibility and sobriety, and Principal Chen's report on the children's improved school performance all suggest that this family is healing rather than deteriorating. Judge Morrison paused, gathering her thoughts for the final pronouncement. The courtroom was so quiet that Eli could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Therefore, this court finds that while Mrs. Blackwood's past actions were concerning and placed her children at risk, her recent progress demonstrates a genuine commitment to recovery and improved parenting. The medical evidence suggests that her addiction was complicated by an undiagnosed seizure disorder, and her compliance with treatment for both conditions indicates a strong prognosis for continued stability. Mara's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she began to understand what the judge was saying. Custody of Wren and Jonah Blackwood will remain with their mother, Mara Blackwood, subject to the following conditions. Mrs. Blackwood will submit to random drug and alcohol testing for a period of 6 months. She will maintain compliance with all medical treatments and attend all scheduled therapy appointments. She will continue participating in Alcoholics Anonymous or a similar support program. Monthly home visits by social services will continue for 6 months, with quarterly visits for an additional year. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to break the spell of silence. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as Mara collapsed into David Chen's arms, sobbing with relief. Mrs. Patterson was crying in the gallery, and Tom Martinez was shaking hands with anyone within reach. Margaret Chen made her way to Eli's side, squeezing his shoulder with wordless understanding. But it was the moment when Mara turned to look at him through her tears that Eli would remember forever. In her face, he saw not just gratitude but transformation, a woman who had faced the worst judgment she could imagine and emerged still whole, still a mother, still fighting for the life she wanted to build. "We did it," she whispered when she reached him. "We actually did it." "You did it," Eli corrected gently. "You stood up and told your truth, and it was enough." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse, Eli thought about the twins waiting at school, unaware that their world had just been saved. Tomorrow was December 19th. Christmas was 6 days away. For the first time in 2 years, the Blackwood family would spend it together in their own home, not as perfect people but as healing people who had refused to give up on each other. 6 months later, the new family drawing covered most of Wren's desk during art time, a crayon masterpiece that told the story of transformation in primary colors and careful strokes. The house still had the same red door, but now flowers bloomed in window boxes and the sun overhead looked less desperate, more naturally bright. The 3 figures in front, mother, daughter, son, stood closer together than in previous drawings, their stick figure hands interlinked. And yes, the 4th figure was still there, the man with kind eyes who had somehow become part of their story. "It's our real family now," Wren explained to Eli as he admired her artwork. "Not pretend like before, real like it is, every day." Summer had come to Pine Ridge with its usual glory, wildflowers carpeting the mountain meadows, the creek running high with snow melt, the kind of endless daylight that made everything seem possible. Eli's classroom windows were open to catch the breeze, and his students were focused on their end-of-year projects with the scattered attention of children already dreaming of vacation. But it was the changes in Wren and Jonah that truly marked how far they'd traveled from that grey October afternoon when they'd asked him to fix their mother. The hypervigilance had faded from their small faces, replaced by the natural curiosity of children who felt safe enough to explore their world. They laughed more readily, spoke up more often, and had developed the kind of sibling rivalry that only emerged when kids didn't need to band together against adult chaos. "Mr. Ramsey," Jonah said, approaching his desk with the careful formality he still used for important announcements. "Mama wants to know if you can come to dinner tonight. She's making her special spaghetti, and she has something to show you." Eli smiled, thinking of how these dinner invitations had become a regular part of his life. What had started as professional concern had evolved into something deeper, not romantic love, though he'd wondered about that possibility, but the profound bond of people who had fought together for something precious and won. "Tell your mama I'll be there," he said, "and ask her if she needs me to bring anything." "Just yourself," Wren chimed in. "Mama says you always bring yourself, and that's the best present anyone can give." The afternoon pickup had become a ritual that bore no resemblance to those early days of anxiety and uncertainty. Mara arrived promptly at 3:15, her truck running smoothly thanks to Tom Martinez's mechanical attention and her own careful maintenance. She looked healthy, not just sober, but genuinely well. Her hair caught the sunlight as she walked toward the school, and her step had the confidence of someone who had made peace with herself. "How was your day?" she asked the twins as they climbed into the truck, the same question millions of parents ask their children every afternoon. But Eli knew that for Mara, being present for this simple exchange represented a victory she never took for granted. The drive to the Blackwood house took him through countryside he'd come to love, past Mrs. Patterson's vegetable garden, where she grew tomatoes that she shared with half the neighborhood, past the creek where the twins had learned to skip stones, past the old barn where someone had painted a new mural to replace the fading wildflowers. Pine Ridge felt different to him now, less like a place to hide and more like a place to belong. The house itself had undergone a quiet transformation over the months. The rotting porch steps had been replaced with sturdy pine boards that Tom Martinez had installed at cost. The peeling paint had been scraped and refreshed, the windows cleaned until they sparkled in the mountain light. Mara's garden flourished in the front yard, not just vegetables for the table, but flowers that served no purpose except beauty. But it was her studio that showed the most dramatic change. What had once been a storage shed filled with broken dreams was now a working artist's space, complete with proper lighting, organized supplies, and canvases in various stages of completion. Mara's painting had evolved beyond therapeutic exercise into genuine artistic expression, and word of her talent was spreading beyond Pine Ridge. "Close your eyes," she told Eli, as she led him into the studio that evening after dinner. "I want this to be a surprise." When she told him to look, he found himself staring at a painting that took his breath away. It was the view from the elementary school playground, the mountains in the distance, the old oak tree where the twins used to sit, the building itself bathed in golden afternoon light. But in the foreground, painted with loving detail, were dozens of children at play, their faces bright with joy and possibility. "It's for the school," Mara explained, suddenly shy. "Margaret asked if I'd be willing to donate something for the main hallway. I thought about all the places that shaped our lives, and I kept coming back to that playground where my children learned they were safe." Eli studied the painting more closely and realized he could identify individual students: Sarah's grandmother, picking her up by the fence, Tommy's mother in her nurse scrubs. The twins themselves sitting under their tree but no longer isolated, now surrounded by friends who had learned to include them. "It's extraordinary," he said, meaning it completely. "You've captured something essential about childhood, about the safety that allows kids to be kids." "I had a good teacher," Mara said softly, and he knew she wasn't talking about art instruction. Later, after the twins were asleep and the dishes were done, Eli and Mara sat on the front porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. These quiet conversations had become precious to both of them: time to process the day, to plan for tomorrow, to acknowledge how far they'd traveled from those desperate early days. "The social worker came by yesterday," Mara said, her tone conversational rather than anxious. "Mrs. Chen, Margaret's replacement since Mrs. Hendricks retired. She said this will probably be one of the last visits, officially, I mean. She might still stop by sometimes just to say hello." "How does that feel?" Eli asked. "Free," Mara said immediately. "Like I'm finally trusted to be their mother without supervision. Like I've proven that people can change, really change, when they get the help they need." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the sounds of a summer evening in the mountains, crickets chirping, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine needles. "Eli," Mara said eventually, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." He turned to face her, noting the serious tone in her voice. "When this all started, when the twins first asked you to help, did you ever really believe it would work out? Did you ever think we'd make it to this place?" Eli considered the question carefully, thinking back to that October afternoon when two frightened children had shown him their drawing of a broken family. "I believed you deserved the chance to try," he said finally. "I believed your children deserved someone who wouldn't give up on their family. But honestly, I was terrified most of the time that we'd fail, that I'd have to watch another family destroyed by addiction." "Another family?" It was the first time he'd mentioned his own history directly, though Mara had sensed the personal connections that drove his commitment to their cause. "My mother," he said simply. "She died when I was 10. Alcohol poisoning. I spent my whole childhood waiting for someone to save her, to save us. When your twins asked me to fix their mother, I couldn't walk away from that request." Mara reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "I'm sorry you lost her, but Eli, you have to know you didn't just save us, you saved yourself too. You got to be the person who doesn't give up. You got to rewrite that ending." As if summoned by their conversation, the twins appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas and sleepy expressions. "We can't sleep," Ren announced. "The moon is too bright, and we keep thinking about happy things." "What kind of happy things?" Mara asked, opening her arms to gather both children close. "About how tomorrow is Saturday, and we can paint in the studio," Jonah said. "About how Mr. Ramsey is going to help us build that treehouse," Ren added. "About how we're a real family now," they said together, with the unconscious synchronization that twins sometimes shared. Eli looked at the four of them sitting together on the porch of a house that had been transformed by love and hard work and stubborn hope. In Wren's latest drawing, he'd been included in their family portrait, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who belonged in the picture. Sometimes the most important questions children asked weren't about math or science or reading. Sometimes they asked you to believe in healing when healing seemed impossible, to choose hope when despair made more sense, to stay when leaving would be easier. The twins had asked him to make their mother better, and in trying to answer that impossible request, they'd all discovered something profound. Families weren't just born, they were built. Love wasn't just felt, it was chosen. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got the chance to help write an ending that was better than anyone dared to dream when the story began. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Sometimes our greatest shame becomes the doorway to our greatest blessing. In the frontier town of Cold Mercy, Preacher Mercer hands his pregnant daughter over to a giant rancher named Cade Rawlins. Everyone thinks it's punishment. Everyone thinks she'll suffer. But Cade does something nobody expects. He treats her with kindness. He gives her safety. He sees her worth when nobody else will. What happens when the man everyone fears becomes the only person who truly loves her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cold Mercy's dusty main street, but there was nothing warm about the light that filtered through the grimy windows of the general store. Mrs. Abernathy pressed her thin lips together as she watched Lila Jane Mercer walk past, her condition now impossible to hide beneath the loose-fitting dress that had once belonged to her mother. "Shameful," she whispered to her husband, loud enough for half the store to hear. "That poor preacher, having to bear such disgrace from his own flesh and blood." Lila kept her chin up as she passed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. At 19, she had learned to navigate the cruel currents of small-town judgment, but these past months had tested even her strongest reserves. The weight in her belly had grown heavier with each passing week, and with it, the weight of her father's disappointment. Cold Mercy, Montana Territory, had earned its name honestly. Carved from unforgiving wilderness in 1867, the town clung to survival through sheer stubbornness and the kind of moral rigidity that could freeze a man's soul even in summer. The main street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen better days before most folks could remember. At one end stood the Methodist church, its white steeple rising like an accusing finger toward heaven. At the other, the saloon squatted like a toad, drawing the kind of men the good ladies of Cold Mercy pretended not to notice. Between these two poles of salvation and sin, the townspeople lived their careful lives, always mindful of who was watching and what they might say. In a place where winter could kill you, and neighbors were your only lifeline, reputation mattered more than money. A good name could get you credit at the store, help when your roof leaked, or a place by the fire when the wolves came calling. A bad name could leave you dead in a ditch with nobody to mourn your passing. Lila had grown up understanding this delicate balance, raised in the shadow of her father's pulpit, where every word mattered and every action carried the weight of divine judgment. Reverend Isaiah Mercer had built his reputation on moral certitude and righteous fire, delivering sermons that could make grown men weep for their sins and wives examine their own hearts for hidden transgressions. He was a tall man, with silver threading through his dark beard, hands that could thunder against the lectern or comfort the grieving with equal conviction. But those same hands had trembled when Dr. Morrison confirmed what Lila herself had known for weeks. Those same hands had clenched into fists when she refused to name the father, protecting a man who had already fled town without so much as a farewell note. "You have brought shame upon this house," he had said that terrible evening 3 months ago, his voice hollow as a tomb. "Shame upon my ministry, shame upon your mother's memory." The mention of her mother had cut deepest of all. Sarah Beth Mercer had died when Lila was 12, carried off by consumption that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. She had been the gentle heart of their home, the one who balanced Isaiah's righteousness with tenderness, who read stories by lamplight and pressed wildflowers between the pages of her worn leather Bible. That Bible now sat on Lila's nightstand, its pages yellow with age and marked with her mother's careful notations in the margins. Lila could still remember her mother's voice, soft as summer rain. "Love is patient, my darling. Love is kind. It keeps no record of wrongs." But her father seemed to have forgotten those words, along with so many others that spoke of forgiveness and redemption. The pregnancy had not been born of love, though Lila had thought it might be at the time. Thomas Whitmore had been everything a young woman might dream of in a frontier town, handsome, charming, full of promises about the life they would build together. He had courted her properly for 6 months, attending church services and asking her father's permission to walk her home on Sunday evenings. He spoke of marriage, of a small ceremony in the spring, of children who would grow up knowing both their parents' love. But when autumn came, and her monthly courses did not, Thomas had proven to be made of lesser stuff than his fine words suggested. The very night she told him about the child, he packed his belongings and caught the next stage out of town, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note claiming urgent business in Denver. That had been 7 months ago, and Denver might as well have been the moon for all the chance she had of finding him. Now, as winter loosened its grip on the mountain valleys and spring struggled to assert itself, Lila faced a future as uncertain as the weather. Her father's congregation whispered behind their hands about the preacher's fallen daughter. The ladies of the church auxiliary had stopped inviting her to their quilting circles. Even her oldest friend, Mary Catherine, now crossed the street rather than speak to her in public. The isolation might have broken a weaker spirit, but Lila had inherited more than her mother's Bible. She had her father's backbone, even if she lacked his capacity for cold judgment. She had learned to find comfort in small things, the way morning light fell across her bedroom floor, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the movement of life within her womb that reminded her she was not entirely alone. Still, the loneliness cut deep, especially in the long hours after dark, when her father locked himself in his study to prepare sermons about sin and redemption that seemed directed more at his congregation than at his own heart. He had grown distant since her condition became known, speaking to her only when necessary, and then with the formal politeness he might show a stranger seeking charity. The house that had once rung with laughter and heated discussions about Scripture now felt like a tomb. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against china. Evening prayers had dwindled to perfunctory mutterings that carried no warmth, no hope, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting across from him had once been the apple of his eye. It was in this atmosphere of cold disappointment that Lila first heard the name Cade Rawlins spoken in connection with her future. She had been returning from the mercantile, her arms full of supplies for the evening meal, when she caught fragments of conversation drifting from her father's study. "Practical solution to your problem, Reverend," came a voice she recognized as belonging to Mayor Hutchins. "Man like that, he's used to taking care of strays." "I will not have my daughter treated as livestock," her father replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Now, Isaiah, you know Cade's got a good reputation for treating his animals fair. Never heard tell of him being cruel to anything under his care. And Lord knows the man could use some company out there on that spread of his." Lila pressed herself against the hallway wall. Packages clutched to her chest, straining to hear more. Cade Rawlins was a name everyone in Cold Mercy knew, though few could claim to know the man himself. He owned a substantial ranch 15 miles north of town, running cattle and horses on land that stretched from the valley floor to the tree line. Folks said he was a veteran of the war between the states, that he had seen things that left him preferring the company of animals to people. He came to town perhaps once a month for supplies, a giant of a man who moved with surprising quiet for his size. Children stared at him from behind their mothers' skirts, and grown men stepped aside when he walked past. Not from fear, exactly, but from the kind of respect reserved for forces of nature, thunderstorms, avalanches, and men who carried their grief like boulders on their shoulders. He's a good Christian man, Mayor Hutchins continued, pays his bills, keeps to himself, never caused trouble for anyone, and he's got that big house sitting empty except for himself. What you're suggesting is barbaric, her father said, but again, there was that telltale hesitation that spoke of a man grasping for solutions to an impossible problem. What I'm suggesting is practical. The girl needs somewhere to go, and you need your reputation intact. Cade needs, well, Lord knows what Cade needs, but he's got the space and the means to provide for her. Might work out better than you think. Lila had heard enough. She crept back to the kitchen and set about preparing dinner with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The conversation continued in the study for another hour, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of negotiation. By the time her father called her to set the table, she could see in his eyes that some decision had been reached. But it would be 3 more days before he found the courage to tell her what that decision was. 3 days during which the weight of unspoken words hung over their house like smoke from a distant fire. 3 days during which Lila watched her father wrestle with his conscience and saw that conscience lose the battle, piece by piece, to his pride and his fear of what the town might say if he kept her under his roof much longer. When he finally spoke the words that would change her life forever, they would come not as a father's love seeking the best for his child, but as a preacher's judgment, seeking the preservation of his own salvation. And Lila would learn that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the language of necessity, delivered by those who claim to love us most. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning, when the March wind carried the promise of spring, but still held winter's bite. Lila was hanging laundry behind the house, her movements careful and deliberate, as her pregnancy had grown more pronounced with each passing week. The sheets snapped like flags of surrender in the gusting air, and she paused to press a hand to her lower back, where a persistent ache had settled. Lila Jane. Her father's voice cut through the morning stillness with the same authority he used to call his congregation to repentance. Come inside. We need to talk. She knew from his tone that the time for avoiding difficult conversations had passed. The way he stood in the doorway, his shoulders set and his mouth drawn into a hard line, told her that whatever decision had been brewing in his study these past days was about to be delivered like a final judgment. Inside the parlor, 2 men waited beside her father. Mayor Hutchins sat in the good chair, his hat balanced on his knees, and his face wearing the careful neutrality of a man conducting unpleasant business. The other man she recognized, but had never formally met Cade Rawlins himself, standing near the window, with his hat in his hands, and his eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass. He was even larger than she remembered from her glimpses of him in town, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched the seams of his worn work shirt. His hair was dark brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his hands that drew her attention, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, yet somehow gentle in the way he held his hat, as if he understood that even inanimate objects deserved careful treatment. "Sit down, daughter." Her father's voice had taken on the formal cadence he used for serious church business. "Mr. Rawlins and I have reached an understanding about your situation." Lila lowered herself into the chair across from Mayor Hutchins, her heart beginning to race as the full implications of what was happening became clear. "My situation? Your condition has become a source of considerable difficulty for this household," her father continued, pacing behind his chair like a prosecutor before a jury. "As a man of God, I have a responsibility to my congregation, to this community, and to the reputation of the church itself. Your presence here, in your current state, undermines my ability to minister effectively to those who look to me for moral guidance." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the veneer of righteousness. "Father, I have prayed about this extensively," he cut her off, his voice growing stronger, as if drawing power from the familiar rhythms of moral certitude. and I believe the Lord has provided a solution that serves everyone's best interests. Mr. Rawlins has graciously agreed to take responsibility for you until such time as your situation resolves itself." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Lila stared at her father, waiting for him to explain that this was some elaborate joke, that the man who had raised her and taught her about God's love would never actually sell his own daughter like a piece of unwanted furniture. But his eyes held no warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting before him had ever been anything more than an inconvenient burden to be disposed of. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "You can't just give me away." "I can and I will," her father replied with the finality of scripture. "Mr. Rawlins has agreed to provide for your needs until the child is born. After that, arrangements can be made for its care and your future." Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Lila, this is really for the best. Mr. Rawlins has a fine spread up north, plenty of room, and he's a God-fearing man who'll see you're treated proper." For the first time since entering the room, Cade Rawlins spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Begging your pardon, Mayor, but I think the lady should hear this from me direct." He turned from the window to face her, and Lila was startled by the kindness she saw in his dark eyes. They were the color of rich earth after rain, and they held none of the judgment or calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces around town. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was gentle despite its depth, "I want you to know that this arrangement, if you agree to it, will be conducted with all the respect and propriety you deserve. You'll have your own room in the main house, your own space to do as you please. I won't ask anything of you except to let me provide for your needs until you decide what you want to do next." "And if I refuse?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer from the set of her father's jaw. "Then you're welcome to seek shelter wherever you can find it," her father said coldly. "But you will not do so under my roof or with my name to protect you." The cruelty of it took her breath away. In that moment, she saw her father clearly, for perhaps the first Timano as the righteous man of God she had always believed him to be, but as a weak man whose pride mattered more than his daughter's welfare, whose reputation meant more than the child he had raised and claimed to love. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There are papers to be signed, of course, legal documents transferring responsibility and such. Nothing permanent, you understand, just until the situation stabilizes." "Papers," Lila repeated numbly. The words seemed to echo in the small room, reducing her entire existence to lines of ink on parchment. "It's all perfectly legal and proper," Mayor Hutchins assured her, producing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Rawlins assumes responsibility for your care and maintenance, and in return receives certain considerations regarding your welfare and that of the child." Cade Rawlins stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Now hold on there, Mayor. We never discussed any considerations about the child. That's not what I agreed to." "Well, naturally, if you're providing for the mother, there are certain expectations." "The only expectation," Cade interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both other men pause, "is that I provide a safe place for this young lady to have her baby in peace. Nothing more, nothing less." He looked directly at Lila then, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in months: genuine concern for her well-being, rather than worry about what her presence might cost him. "Miss Mercer," he said carefully, "if you're willing to come stay at my place, I promise you'll be treated with respect. You'll have privacy, comfort, and safety for as long as you need it. And when you're ready to decide what comes next, that'll be your choice to make, not mine or anyone else's." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited for her response. Lila looked around at the faces surrounding her father's cold determination, Mayor Hutchins' bureaucratic discomfort, and Cade Rawlins' unexpected compassion. The choice, such as it was, seemed absurdly simple. She could stay and continue to endure her father's contempt and the town's whispered condemnation, growing heavier and more isolated with each passing day until the birth itself became just another source of shame to be hidden away. Or she could take a chance on the kindness she saw in a stranger's eyes, trusting that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. "I'll need to pack my things," she said quietly. Her father nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of business concluded and burdens lifted. "Mr. Rawlins will return for you tomorrow morning. Be ready." As the men filed out of the parlor to complete their arrangements, Lila remained in her chair, one hand resting on her belly where her child stirred restlessly, as if sensing the monumental change that was coming. Through the window, she could see Cade Rawlins speaking quietly with her father near the front gate, and she caught fragments of his words carried on the wind. "I'll build her a room with windows," he was saying, and something in his tone suggested this was both a promise and a warning. "She'll want to see the sky." For the first time in months, Lila felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. The journey to Cade Rawlins' ranch took most of the morning, winding through mountain passes where snow still clung to the shadows and early wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Lila sat beside him on the wagon seat, her few possessions secured in the back alongside supplies from town, and tried not to think about how thoroughly her life had changed in the space of 24 hours. Cade drove with the easy competence of a man comfortable with horses and distance, speaking little but pointing out landmarks along the way. A creek where elk came to drink, a stand of aspen trees that turned gold in autumn, a rocky outcropping where eagles nested each spring. His voice when he spoke was gentle, free of the judgment she had grown accustomed to hearing in town. "That's my north pasture," he said as they crested a hill, and the ranch spread out below them. "Cattle winter there mostly, though I move them up higher come summer." Lila gazed down at the valley with something approaching wonder. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the light like welcoming eyes. Outbuildings dotted the property: a barn, corrals, a chicken coop, and what looked like a workshop, all connected by well-worn paths and rail fences that spoke of careful maintenance and pride in the work. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Cade glanced at her with surprise, as if he had expected criticism rather than appreciation. "Gets lonely sometimes, but it's good land. Been in my family since before the war." As they drew closer to the house, Lila could see more details that spoke to the character of the man beside her. The porch railings were carved with intricate patterns that suggested long winter evenings spent with careful hands and sharp tools. Flower boxes beneath the windows held the stubble of last year's plantings, waiting for someone to coax new life from their soil. A vegetable garden plot had been prepared for spring planting, the soil dark and rich and ready. "I've got the room ready for you," Cade said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and brief in their contact. "It's got windows facing east and south, so you'll get good light most of the day." The interior of the house was as carefully maintained as the exterior, with wide plank floors polished smooth by years of use and furniture that spoke of quality rather than showiness. Quilts hung over chairbacks, and the stone fireplace showed signs of regular use. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Lila caught titles that suggested a man of broader interests than his quiet demeanor might indicate. "Kitchen's through there," Cade said, setting her bags down near the staircase. "You're welcome to anything you need. I usually eat simple meat, bread, whatever vegetables I can manage from the garden, but if you know how to cook different, I'd be grateful for the change." He led her upstairs to a room that took her breath away. It was larger than her bedroom at home, with windows on 2 walls that looked out over the valley and mountains beyond. A quilt covered the bed, and someone, Cade, she realized, had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the dresser, their yellow petals bright against the dark wood. But it was the piece of furniture in the corner that made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. A wooden cradle sat there, clearly handmade, with sides carved in the same intricate patterns she had noticed on the porch railings. The wood was smooth as silk, sanded and oiled until it gleamed, and lined with soft fabric that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from one of the quilts downstairs. "You made this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. "Figured you might need it come time. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid. Should last." Lila reached out to touch the smooth wood, overwhelmed by this evidence of thoughtfulness from a man who barely knew her. In town, people crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her condition. Her own father spoke of her pregnancy as a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be welcomed. But this stranger had spent hours crafting something beautiful for a child he would never claim, simply because he saw a need and chose to fill it. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, and meant every word. "I'll leave you to get settled," Cade said, backing toward the door with the awkward haste of a man unaccustomed to emotional displays. "Supper's usually around 6, but don't feel obliged. You can eat when you want, sleep when you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." After he left, Lila sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was somehow already more welcoming than the house where she had spent 19 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming her face and highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. For the first time in months, she felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had grown so familiar. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. That evening, she ventured downstairs to find Cade in the kitchen, wrestling with what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at biscuits. Flour dusted his shirt and the counter, and the expression on his face suggested that cooking was not among his natural talents. "Might I help?" she offered, and at his grateful nod, she took over the preparation while he set the table with the careful precision of a man determined to do things properly. They ate by lamplight, speaking little but comfortably, like old friends who didn't need words to fill every silence. Cade asked about her preferences for breakfast, whether she liked her coffee strong or weak, if there were foods that disagreed with her condition. Simple questions, practical concerns, but underneath them lay a consideration for her welfare that warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. "Thank you," she said as they finished the meal, "for all of this, for the room, the cradle, for treating me like a person deserving of respect." Cade finished quietly. "That's not something you should have to thank anyone for, Miss Mercer. That's just how things ought to be." That night, Lila lay in her new bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling around hearth, creak of wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like scattered diamonds, and for the first time since learning about her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something more than shame and sorrow. In the room below, she could hear Cade moving around the kitchen, banking the fire, and securing the house for the night. The sounds were comforting rather than intrusive, the careful actions of a man taking responsibility for those under his protection. When all was quiet, she placed her hand on her belly, where her child rested, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for whatever providence had led her to this place, to this man who saw her worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. Spring arrived at the ranch with gentle insistence, coaxing green shoots from the dark earth and filling the air with the promise of renewal. Lila had been there 2 weeks, and each day brought small revelations about the man who had taken her in and the life they were cautiously building together. She had discovered that Cade rose before dawn, moving through the house with surprising quiet for such a large man, always careful not to wake her as he prepared for the day's work. By the time she made her way downstairs, coffee would be waiting on the stove and eggs gathering in a basket by the back door, evidence of his morning rounds through the chicken coop. "You don't have to cook for me," he had said that first week, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes when she insisted on taking over the kitchen duties. It gave her purpose, a way to contribute to the household that didn't involve charity or pity. This morning, like the others, she found him in the vegetable garden plot behind the house, turning soil that had been waiting all winter for attention. His shirt was already damp with perspiration despite the cool air, and dirt clung to his hands and forearms as he worked the stubborn earth into neat rows. "What will you plant?" she asked, settling carefully on the porch steps where she could watch him work. "The usual: potatoes, beans, carrots, onions, whatever keeps well through winter." He paused in his digging to look at her. "You have thoughts on the matter?" The question surprised her. Thomas had never asked her opinion about anything more substantial than what dress to wear to church. Her father made pronouncements rather than seeking input, but Cade seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "My mother used to grow herbs," she said, remembering Sarah Beth's small garden behind the parsonage. "Sage and thyme, parsley and dill. She said they made even simple food taste like celebration." "Herbs would be good," Cade agreed, resuming his work. "Haven't had much call for them, cooking just for myself, but I reckon that's about to change." Later that morning, Lila found a packet of wildflower seeds in the supply closet, clearly forgotten from some previous spring's ambitious plans. Without asking permission, she claimed a corner of the garden plot and scattered the seeds with the same faith her mother had shown in her herb garden trust, that something beautiful could grow from the simplest beginnings. As the days lengthened and warmed, she found herself venturing farther from the house, exploring the ranch with the careful steps of someone learning to trust her feet again. Cade had introduced her to the animals with the formal courtesy he might use for distinguished guests. There was Duchess, an ancient milk cow with wise eyes and a gentle disposition. The horses, Thunder, Belle, and Smoku, came to the fence when she approached, curious about this new presence in their domain. "They're good judges of character," Cade had said, watching Belle nuzzle Lila's palm in search of treats. "Animals know things about people that people sometimes miss about themselves." The chickens proved to be the most entertaining, a collection of hens with distinct personalities, and a rooster named Napoleon, who took his responsibilities seriously. Lila discovered that gathering eggs could be either a peaceful meditation or a military operation, depending on Napoleon's mood and whether he deemed her worthy of access to his ladies. "He's protective," Cade explained after Napoleon had chased her from the coop in a flurry of indignant squawking. "Can't fault him for that." In the evenings, after the animals were tended and the day's work complete, they fell into a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet conversation. Cade proved to be a better listener than talker, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her to speak about things she had kept locked away for months. "You miss teaching," he observed one evening, as she described her work at the small school in Cold Mercy, before her condition made it impossible to continue. "I miss the children," she said, surprised by how much the admission hurt. "They didn't care about my circumstances. They just wanted to learn their letters and hear stories." "You could teach again," Cade said carefully. "When you're ready. There are always children who need learning, and not all of them are lucky enough to live in towns with proper schools." The possibility had never occurred to her. In her father's house, her pregnancy had felt like an ending, the conclusion of all her dreams and aspirations. But here, watching the sun set over the valley while her child stirred restlessly in her womb, she could almost imagine a different kind of future. "Tell me about the war," she said one evening, recognizing in his eyes the same shadows she had seen in other veterans who had passed through Cold Mercy. Cade was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too heavy for one man to bear alone. "Lost a lot of good men," he said simply. "Came home to find I'd lost my wife too. Consumption took her while I was gone, and nobody thought to write and tell me until it was too late for goodbyes." The pain in his voice made her chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stared into the fire for a moment before continuing. "Used to think this place was too quiet, too empty. But quiet's not so bad when it's the right kind of quiet. When it's peaceful instead of just hollow." She understood what he meant. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than judgment. It was the kind of quiet that came from shared understanding, from two people who had both learned that life could disappoint you in ways you never expected, but still surprise you with unexpected grace. "Cade," she said, using his name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Why did you agree to take me in? Really? He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious and honest. Because nobody deserves to be thrown away like rubbish, especially not when they're carrying life. And because this place needed someone who could see its beauty instead of just its loneliness. That night, as she watched her wildflower seeds beginning to sprout in neat green rows, Lila realized that something was growing inside her too, not just the child she carried, but hope itself, taking root in soil that had seemed barren just weeks before. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The discovery came by accident on a warm May morning when Lila was helping Cade organize his cluttered desk in search of receipts for the tax assessor. She had been staying at the ranch for 6 weeks, and their easy partnership had extended to household tasks that he had clearly been neglecting for years. "You keep your important papers in the oddest places," she said, pulling a deed from between the pages of a veterinary manual. "How do you ever find anything?" "I mostly don't," Cade admitted, sorting through a stack of correspondence that dated back several years. "Never was much good at the business side of ranching. I just know how to work the land and care for the animals." It was while reaching for a ledger on the highest shelf that her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden box pushed far back behind the books. When she brought it down, Cade's entire body went still, his face draining of color as he recognized what she held. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, seeing his distress. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, though his voice had gone hoarse. "I'd forgotten it was there." The box was made of the same fine wood as her cradle, polished smooth by handling and age. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a military Medaltha bronze star, she realized, recognizing it from illustrations she had seen in newspapers during the war. Beneath it was a small daguerreotype of a young woman with gentle eyes and a smile that spoke of quiet happiness. "Your wife," Lila said softly, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Mary Elizabeth." Cade's voice was barely above a whisper. She was. She was everything good about this place, everything I was fighting to come home to. Lila studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face the kind of serene beauty that came from deep contentment rather than mere physical features. This was someone who had been truly loved, truly cherished, and the knowledge of what Cade had lost made her heart ache for him. She would have been a wonderful mother, she said, instinctively understanding that this was at the heart of his grief. She wanted children more than anything, Cade confirmed, taking the photograph with reverent care. "We tried for 3 years before I left for the war. She was so sure that by the time I came home, but the consumption took that dream along with everything else." "Tell me about her," Lila said, settling into the chair across from him. "What was she like?" For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then something in his expression softened, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "She laughed at everything," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Used to say that life was too hard to waste time being grim about it. She could find joy in the smallest things, a butterfly in the garden, a good crop of tomatoes, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table." As he spoke, Lila could see Mary Elizabeth taking shape in her mind, a woman who had filled this house with warmth and laughter, who had made Cade believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. No wonder the place had felt hollow to him after her death. No wonder he had retreated into solitude rather than try to rebuild what they had shared. "She sounds wonderful," Lila said, meaning it completely. "She was, and she would have liked you." Cade looked up from the photograph to meet her eyes. "She would have said you had a strong spirit, that you'd survived things that would have broken lesser women. She always could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house, unusual enough to make them both look toward the window with concern. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unannounced visitors were virtually unheard of. "Stay here," Cade said, but Lila was already moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. 3 men sat on horseback in the yard, their clothes marking them as townspeople rather than neighboring ranchers. She recognized one of them, Dr. Morrison, who had confirmed her pregnancy what seemed like a lifetime ago. The other two were strangers, but their bearing suggested official business of some kind. "Dr. Morrison's here," she said, her stomach clenching with sudden anxiety. "With two men I don't recognize." Cade cursed under his breath, carefully placing his wife's photograph back in its box. "Probably the territorial health inspector and a deputy marshal. I was wondering when they'd show up." "What do they want?" "To make sure you're being treated properly. I'd guess. Your father's been getting questions from the church hierarchy about his daughter's sudden disappearance. Had to provide some kind of official explanation." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. "They want to take me back." "Not if I have anything to say about it." Cade's voice carried a quiet determination that reminded her of the military bearing she could sometimes glimpse beneath his civilian gentleness. "But they'll want to inspect the arrangements, ask questions, make sure everything's legal and proper." The knock on the front door was firm and official. Cade straightened his shoulders and walked to answer it, every inch the respectable rancher welcoming unexpected guests. Lila heard the murmur of voices, formal introductions, the kind of careful politeness that preceded difficult conversations. "Miss Mercer," Dr. Morrison said as she entered the parlor, his tone professionally neutral. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison, I'm feeling very well." The health inspector, a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone who found fault with everything he examined, looked around the room with obvious skepticism. "I am Inspector Hartwell from the Territorial Capital. We've received complaints about the irregular nature of your living arrangements here." "Complaints from whom?" Cade asked, though they all knew the answer. "Concerned citizens who question whether proper moral standards are being maintained," the deputy marshal said. He was younger than the others, with the nervous energy of a man eager to prove his authority. "There are laws about unmarried persons of opposite genders cohabitating, especially when one party is in a delicate condition." "Miss Mercer has her own quarters," Cade said evenly. "She receives proper care and supervision. I fail to see what laws might be violated by Christian charity." "Christian charity is one thing," Inspector Hartwell said, producing a notebook and pencil. "But the appearance of impropriety is quite another. I'll need to examine the living arrangements and speak with Miss Mercer privately to ensure she is here of her own free will." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, inspections, and barely concealed accusations. The men examined her room, questioned her about her daily routine, and asked pointed questions about the nature of her relationship with Cade that made her face burn with embarrassment and anger. Through it all, Cade remained calm and respectful, answering their inquiries with the patience of a man who had nothing to hide. But Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when they implied that he might be taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. "Everything appears to be in order," Dr. Morrison said finally, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely pleased with this conclusion. "Miss Mercer seems to be receiving adequate care." "More than adequate," she said firmly, finding her voice at last. "Mr. Rawlins has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. I am here by choice, and I am grateful for his protection." The words seemed to surprise them, as if they had expected to find a frightened, mistreated woman grateful for rescue. Instead, they found someone who spoke with quiet dignity about her circumstances and clear appreciation for the man who had given her sanctuary. After they left, Lila and Cade sat in the parlor, both drained by the encounter. The medal and photograph still lay on the desk between them, reminders of the conversation that had been interrupted by official scrutiny. "This won't be the end of it," Cade said quietly. "Your father's not going to let this rest. He needs to prove that his decision was righteous, that you're being properly managed." "Then what do we do?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shifting in his expression, a decision being made, a line being drawn. "We make sure they have nothing to complain about," he said. "We make this arrangement so respectable, so unquestionably proper, that even your father can't find fault with it." Lila had the distinct feeling that he was talking about something more than just maintaining separate quarters and observing social proprieties. But whatever plan was forming in his mind, She trusted him to handle it with the same careful consideration he had shown her from the very beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a rider who wouldn't meet Lila's eyes as he handed over the envelope. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized with a sinking, heart-bold, confident strokes that had once seemed romantic but now felt like a threat. Thomas Whitmore had found her. Lila sat on the porch steps, the unopened letter trembling in her hands as she watched the messenger disappear down the valley road. Her child had grown active in recent weeks, responding to her moods with restless movement that reminded her constantly of the life she carried and the choices that lay ahead. "Bad news?" Cade asked, emerging from the barn where he had been shoeing one of the horses. He took one look at her face and set down his tools, his expression darkening with concern. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the father of my child." Cade's entire body went still, the way she had seen him react when a storm was approaching, or when something had spooked the cattle. "What does he want?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it yet." She stared at the envelope, as if it might burst into flames at any moment. "I thought he was gone forever. It's been almost 8 months since he left." "Maybe we should read it together," Cade suggested gently, settling beside her on the steps. "Whatever it says, you don't have to face it alone." With shaking fingers, Lila broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting filled a single page, the words as careless and self-serving as the man who had written them. "My dear Lila," she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with anger. "I have recently learned of your situation and current circumstances through mutual acquaintances in Denver. I must say I am disturbed to hear that you have taken up residence with a stranger rather than waiting for my return to properly address our situation." Cade made a sound low in his throat that might have been a growl. "Our situation? The man abandons you and then has the nerve to claim ownership." Lila continued reading, each word stoking the fire of her indignation. "I have concluded my business affairs here and am prepared to return to Cold Mercy to claim what is rightfully mine. I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate discretion until I arrive to make the necessary arrangements for our marriage and the proper raising of my child." "His child," Cade repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's more." Lila's hands were shaking again, but with fury rather than fear. "I trust you will see the wisdom of ending your current inappropriate arrangement immediately. A woman in your condition should not be living in sin with a man who has no legal claim to her welfare. I will arrive by the end of the month to collect you and make proper provision for our family." The letter was signed with Thomas's full name and a flourish that suggested he considered the matter settled by his mere declaration of intent. For several minutes they sat in silence, the weight of Thomas's presumption settling between them like a stone. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise now felt charged with the threat of upheaval, of having the careful sanctuary they had built together torn apart by a man who had forfeited any right to claim either Lila or her child. "He thinks he can just waltz back here and pick up where he left off," Lila said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage. "As if the past 8 months never happened. As if I've been sitting here like some faithful dog waiting for him to remember I exist." "What do you want to do?" Cade asked, and the question surprised her with its simplicity. Not what she should do, or what was proper, or what others might expect what she wanted. "I want to burn this letter and pretend I never received it," she said honestly. "I want Thomas Whitmore to disappear, back to wherever he came from, and leave us in peace." "Us," Cade repeated softly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Cade, She stopped, realizing what she had revealed in her moment of emotional honesty. "I didn't mean to presume." "You weren't presuming anything," he said, his dark eyes serious and intent. "These past months, watching you bloom here, watching you find your strength again, it's been like seeing the ranch come back to life. You belong here, Lila. Not because of some legal arrangement or charitable obligation, but because this place needs you the way the earth needs rain." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. Lila felt her heart racing, not with fear but with a recognition that had been building for weeks, the understanding that what had begun as rescue had grown into something far deeper and more precious. "But Thomas has legal rights," she said, trying to be practical, even as her heart yearned toward the possibility Cade was offering. "He is the father, and unmarried women have few protections under the law. Legal rights can be challenged," Cade said firmly. "A man who abandons a woman when she needs him most, who leaves her to face shame and hardship alone, that's not a father. That's just a man who happened to plant a seed." The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded her of Napoleon defending his hens, but there was something more here, a depth of caring that went beyond mere chivalry or duty. "What are you saying, Cade?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley where their wildflowers had begun to bloom in brilliant patches of color among the green grass. When he spoke, his words were careful, deliberate, weighted with significance. "I'm saying that if you were my wife, legally and properly, Thomas Whitmore would have no claim on you or your child. I'm saying that what we've built here doesn't have to end just because some fool finally remembered his responsibilities." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," Cade said, turning to face her fully. "Not because you need protection, though I'd be honored to provide it. Not because it would solve our immediate problem, though it would. I'm asking because somewhere, in these past months, watching you plant flowers and teach Napoleon proper manners and turn this house back into a home, I fell in love with you." The words seemed to hang in the morning air like music, beautiful and unexpected and perfect in their simplicity. Lila looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who was offering not just his name and protection, but his heart. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like a prayer. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope." "Hope's not something to be afraid of," Cade said, reaching for her hands with the gentle reverence she had come to associate with all his gestures toward her. "Not when it's grounded in truth." He leaned forward then, slowly and carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead tilted her face up toward his, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience and deep affection rather than mere passion. "We'll need to act quickly," he said when they broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "If Thomas is planning to arrive by month's end, we should be married before then. Make it impossible for him to challenge our legal standing." "The preacher in town won't marry us," Cade finished grimly. "Not with your father's opposition and the questions about your condition, but there's a circuit judge who comes through Copper Falls once a month. Judge Harrison, he's a fair man, more concerned with justice than appearances." As they sat together planning their future, Lila felt the last of her fears dissolving like morning mist. Thomas's letter, which had seemed like such a threat just minutes ago, now felt like nothing more than the desperate bluster of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman, but as Lila Rawlins' wife, partner, and beloved companion to a man who had shown her what true love looked like. The journey to Copper Falls took most of the day, winding through mountain passes that Lila had never seen before. She sat beside Cade on the wagon seat, wearing her mother's best dress navy blue with tiny pearl buttons that she had let out as much as possible to accommodate her condition. In her lap she held a small bouquet of wildflowers from their garden, the same varieties she had planted that first hopeful morning at the ranch. Judge Harrison proved to be a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who had spent his career dealing with the realities of frontier life rather than its idealized version. His temporary courthouse was the back room of the Copper Falls Hotel, where he conducted business with the efficient dignity of a man who understood that legal ceremonies should be meaningful rather than merely formal. "Mr. Rawlins, Miss Mercer," he said, looking up from the papers Cade had presented. "I understand you wish to be married today." "Yes, sir," Cade replied, his hand finding Lila's with gentle reassurance. "We have the license and witnesses." The witnesses were the hotel proprietor and his wife, strangers who had agreed to serve in this capacity with the casual kindness that frontier communities showed to those in need of assistance. They stood quietly in the corner, respectful of the solemnity of the moment. "Miss Mercer," Judge Harrison said, his tone gentle but direct, "are you entering into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or undue influence?" "I am," Lila said firmly, meaning every word. "And you understand that marriage is a legal contract with responsibilities and obligations that cannot be easily dissolved?" "We do," they answered together. The ceremony itself was simple but dignified, the judge's words carrying the weight of law and tradition without unnecessary elaboration. When Cade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger run he had purchased that morning from the general store, Lila felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman. She was Lila Rawlins, wife and partner to a man who loved her. The ride home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who had just made a momentous decision and found it good. The late afternoon sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, and their ranch, their home, looked more beautiful than ever as they crested the final hill. But as they drew closer to the house, Lila noticed something that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. 3 horses stood tied to the front porch rail, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the warm weather signs of visitors who had made themselves at home in their absence. "Stay close to me," Cade said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat. They were still 50 yards from the house when the front door opened and 3 men emerged onto the porch. Thomas Whitmore led the group, looking every inch the successful businessman in his fine clothes and polished boots. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, his face wearing the careful neutrality of a politician trying to navigate troubled waters. The third man was a stranger well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Lila," Thomas called out as if greeting a beloved friend rather than the woman he had abandoned 8 months earlier. "Thank God you're safe. When I arrived and found you missing, I feared the worst." Cade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, his body radiating the controlled tension of a man preparing for conflict. "Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you for another week. I was able to conclude my business earlier than anticipated," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on Lila with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I came as soon as I received word about Lila's situation." "Her situation is perfectly respectable," Cade said evenly, helping Lila down from the wagon with careful attention to her condition. "Living in sin with a stranger while carrying my child." Thomas's voice carried the righteous indignation of a man who had convinced himself he was the injured party. "I think not." "Actually," Lila said, finding her voice and her courage, "my situation is that of a properly married woman. Mr. Rawlins and I were wed this afternoon by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls." The silence that followed her announcement was so complete that she could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it made his features ugly. "Impossible," he sputtered. "You can't marry someone else while carrying my child. It's not legal, it's not moral." "It's perfectly legal," the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am attorney Charles Brennan from Denver. Mr. Whitmore engaged my services to ensure the proper resolution of this matter. However, if what you say is true, Mrs. Rawlins, is it? Then the situation has become considerably more complex." Cade reached into his jacket and produced their marriage certificate, the ink still fresh and the judge's seal clearly visible. "Mrs. Rawlins is my wife in every legal sense. Her previous relationship with Mr. Whitmore, whatever its nature, was never formalized through marriage. He has no legal claim on her whatsoever." Attorney Brennan examined the document with the thoroughness of a man trained to find flaws in legal proceedings. After several minutes, He looked up with obvious frustration. "The marriage appears to be entirely valid. Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid your position has become untenable." "My position?" Thomas's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "That's my child she's carrying, my blood. You can't tell me I have no rights to my own offspring." "Actually, I can," Brennan said with professional detachment. "Under territorial law, a child born in wedlock is presumed to be the child of the husband, regardless of the biological circumstances. Mrs. Rawlins' child will be legally considered Mr. Rawlins' child from the moment of birth." The implications of this hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been so confident in his righteousness, so certain that his mere appearance would resolve everything in his favor, that he hadn't considered the possibility that Lila might have moved beyond waiting for his return. "This is outrageous," he declared, turning to Mayor Hutchins as if expecting support. "You can't allow this travesty to stand. The woman was practically given to this man like property. The marriage is clearly a sham, designed to prevent me from claiming what's rightfully mine." "Now see here, young man," Mayor Hutchins said uncomfortably, "the Rawlins marriage may have been sudden, but it appears to be entirely legal. And given your own absence during the lady's time of need, I'm not sure you're in a position to make demands." Lila watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, she had lived in fear of this confrontation, imagining Thomas as a figure of overwhelming authority who could sweep back into her life and reclaim control. Instead, she saw him for what he really was, selfish man who had expected the world to remain frozen in place while he pursued his own interests. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had found her strength, "you made your choice 8 months ago when you left me to face this alone. I've made mine today. Mr. Rawlins, me husband, has shown me more kindness and respect in 3 months than you managed in 6 months of courtship. But the child will be raised by parents who love and want it." Lila interrupted firmly, "by a father who carved its cradle with his own hands and a mother who will teach it that real love means staying, even when times are difficult." Thomas looked around the group, seeking any ally in his cause, but found only faces that ranged from hostile to merely unsympathetic. Even Attorney Brennan, despite being paid for his services, seemed to recognize the futility of challenging a legal marriage based on moral outrage alone. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "I'll find a way to challenge this mockery. That child belongs to me." "No," Cade said, speaking for the first time since presenting their marriage certificate. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man defending his family. "That child belongs to the family that wants it, protects it, and will love it every day of its life. You're not part of that family, Whitmore. You never were." As the 3 men prepared to leave, defeated in their mission but unwilling to acknowledge it gracefully, Lila felt a profound sense of completion. The future she had feared for so many months, a future dominated by shame, obligation, and loveless duty, had been replaced by something infinitely better. She was Mrs. Rawlins now, partner to a man who had proven his love through action rather than words, mother to a child who would grow up knowing security and acceptance rather than shame. And as she watched Thomas Whitmore ride away, disappearing into the gathering twilight like the bad dream he had always been, she knew that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting, but from choosing a different battlefield entirely. The weeks following Thomas's departure brought an unexpected peace to the ranch, as if the very air had been cleansed of the tension that had hung over them since his letter arrived. Lila settled into her new role as Mrs. Rawlins with a contentment that surprised her in its completeness. The gold band on her finger caught the morning light as she gathered eggs, and she found herself pausing to admire it not for its modest beauty, but for what it represented. She was no longer alone. More than that, she was truly wanted. July brought the full heat of summer to the valley, and with it, the constant activity of a working ranch. Lila had grown large with child, her movements careful but determined as she refused to let her condition render her useless. Cade worried constantly about her overexerting herself, but she had discovered that physical activity helped manage the restless energy that came with the final months of pregnancy. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said one morning as he found her in the garden, weeding between the rows of vegetables, despite the early-hour heat. "Least of all to me." "I'm not trying to prove anything," she replied, straightening with one hand pressed to her lower back. "I'm trying to be useful. This baby's going to come whether I sit in a chair all day or keep working. I'd rather be productive." The vegetables they had planted together in the spring had flourished beyond either of their expectations. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their poles with eager abundance, and the herb garden had become a fragrant paradise that made even simple meals taste like celebrations. Lila had discovered that she possessed her mother's gift for coaxing life from the earth, and the evidence of that gift surrounded them in green profusion. But it was the wildflower patch that drew her attention most often. The seeds she had scattered that first hopeful morning had grown into a riot of color-purple lupines, yellow coreopsis, red Indian paintbrush, and white yarrow that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds in delightful abundance. Looking at them, she could measure the distance she had traveled from the frightened, shamed woman who had arrived at the ranch 4 months ago. The transformation was not lost on the neighbors either. Word of their marriage had spread through the mountain communities with the speed that news always traveled in sparsely populated areas. Some of the responses had been predictably judgmental whispered, comments about hasty weddings and questionable circumstances. But others had surprised her with their warmth and acceptance. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose ranch lay 10 miles to the west, had arrived one afternoon with a basket of baby clothes and a matter-of-fact manner that brooked no embarrassment. "Every child needs proper clothing," she had said, unpacking tiny gowns and blankets with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "These belong to my youngest, and they're too good to waste." "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just raise that baby with love and teach it right from wrong. That's all any of us can do." The Hendricks family from the next valley had sent their eldest son with an offer to help with the heavier ranch work as Lila's time drew near. Even crusty old Pete Morrison, who ran cattle on the far side of the mountain, had stopped by to offer his congratulations and share a bottle of whiskey with Cade in celebration of the marriage. "Takes a strong woman to make a go of it out here," he had said, nodding approvingly at Lila's obvious contentment. "And takes a wise man to recognize one when he sees her." But along with the acceptance came other, more troubling developments. Dr. Morrison had stopped by twice in recent weeks, ostensibly to check on Lila's condition, but clearly fishing for information about the circumstances of her marriage. His questions had a pointed quality that suggested someone was encouraging his curiosity. "Everything appears normal," he had said after his most recent examination, "though I confess surprise at how settled you seem, given the unusual circumstances of your situation." "What's unusual about a woman being happy in her marriage?" Lila had asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the doctor step back slightly. "Nothing, of course. Nothing at all. I simply meant, that is, the timing of events." "The timing of events is our business, Dr. Morrison," Cade had interjected with quiet firmness. "I trust you'll respect our privacy in that regard." More concerning had been the letter from her father that arrived the day after Dr. Morrison's second visit. It was the first communication she had received from him since leaving Cold Mercy, and its contents were as cold and judgmental as she had expected. "Lila," she read aloud to Cade that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I have been informed of your recent marriage and find myself deeply disturbed by the haste and circumstances of this union. While I cannot prevent what has already been done, I feel compelled to warn you that Mr. Whitmore has not abandoned his claims regarding the child you carry. He has consulted with legal authorities and may seek to challenge your marriage on grounds of fraud and deception." Cade's jaw tightened as she continued reading. "Furthermore, questions have been raised about the propriety of your living arrangements prior to the wedding ceremony." Several members of my congregation have expressed concern that your marriage may have been contracted solely to avoid the legal consequences of immoral behavior. The man has quite an imagination, Cade said grimly. There's more. Lila's voice had grown steadier with anger. I feel it is my Christian duty to inform you that I cannot in good conscience acknowledge this marriage or any children that may result from it. You have made your choice, and you must live with the consequences. Do not expect support or recognition from your family in this matter. She folded the letter carefully, her hands remarkably steady, despite the emotional impact of her father's rejection. He's disowning me, officially and completely. Are you surprised? Lila considered the question seriously before answering. No, disappointed, but not surprised. My father was always more concerned with appearances than with people, even when I was a child. I suppose I hoped that becoming a grandmother might soften him, but that was naive. His loss, Cade said simply, reaching for her hand. Any man who would disown his own daughter for choosing love over shame isn't much of a father to begin with. The words were comforting, but they couldn't entirely ease the sadness that came with having her fears confirmed. She was truly alone in the world now, except for the man beside her and the child growing within her. It was both terrifying and liberating the knowledge that she had no safety net except what she and Cade built together. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. Active tonight, Cade observed, his eyes crinkling with the gentle humor she had come to love. Very active. I think this child is going to be a handful. Takes after its mother, then. The teasing comment was delivered with such obvious affection that Lila felt her melancholy lifting despite the weight of her father's rejection. This was her family now, this quiet, strong man who had shown her what real love looked like, and the child who would complete their small circle. But even as she treasured these peaceful moments, Lila could not shake the feeling that they were living in a brief calm before a storm. Thomas's threats, her father's warnings, the pointed questions from Dr. Morrison, all of these suggested that their carefully constructed new life was still vulnerable to outside interference. The feeling proved prophetic when a rider arrived the next morning with news that made Cade's face go pale with concern. Thomas Whitmore had returned to Cold Mercy, this time accompanied by a territorial judge and a marshal carrying legal documents that challenged the validity of their marriage. He's claiming fraud, the messenger explained, a young man who clearly relished being the bearer of dramatic news. Says you coerced Miss Mercer, Mrs. Rawlins, into marrying you to avoid facing charges for harboring a woman in immoral circumstances. Says the whole thing was a sham to cover up improper relations. That's ridiculous, Lila said, her voice sharp with indignation. Maybe so, Mum, but Judge Carmichael takes these things serious. He's ordered you both to appear in Cold Mercy tomorrow for a formal hearing. Says if you don't show, he'll issue a warrant for your arrest. As the messenger rode away, leaving them to absorb this new crisis, Lila felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. Just when she had found safety and happiness, just when she had begun to believe that the worst was behind them, the past had reached out to drag her back into uncertainty. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the note of fear that had crept into her voice. Cade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the mountains that ringed their valley like protective walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet determination she had heard the day he first brought her to the ranch. "We go to Cold Mercy," he said simply. "We tell the truth, and we fight for what's ours." The words were brave, but as Lila looked toward the town that had been so eager to cast her out, she wondered if the truth would be enough to protect the life they had built together. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether love could truly triumph over the forces of shame and judgment that had ruled her life for so long. The courthouse in Cold Mercy had never seemed so imposing as it did on that sweltering August morning when Lila and Cade arrived to defend their marriage. The building, which normally served as a meeting hall for town functions, had been transformed into a formal court with Judge Carmichael's bench positioned beneath the large window that faced Main Street. Half the town seemed to have gathered for the proceedings, filling every available seat and lining the walls with the eager anticipation of spectators at a prize fight. Lila walked slowly up the courthouse steps, her hand resting on Cade's steady arm for support. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, but she held her head high as she passed through the crowd of familiar faces. Some watched with open hostility, others with curiosity, but a few like Mrs. Patterson and the Hendricks family offered encouraging nods that reminded her she was not entirely without allies. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Brennan, his expression radiating the confidence of a man certain of victory. He had dressed for the occasion in his finest suit, every inch the successful businessman seeking justice against rural fraudsters. When Lila entered the room, his eyes fixed on her swollen figure with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Judge Carmichael was a stern-faced man in his 50s, appointed by the territorial government and known for his strict interpretation of the law. He called the proceedings to order with the sharp rap of his gavel, and the murmur of conversation died immediately. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Whitmore versus Rawlins," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Mr. Whitmore seeks to have the marriage between Mr. Cade Rawlins and the former Miss Lila Mercer declared invalid on grounds of fraud and coercion." Attorney Brennan rose smoothly to present his case, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, was engaged in legitimate business in Denver when he learned that the woman carrying his child had been essentially sold to Mr. Rawlins by her father. Rather than wait for Mr. Whitmore's return to properly address the situation, Mr. Rawlins took advantage of Miss Mercer's vulnerable condition to enter into a fraudulent marriage designed solely to prevent Mr. Whitmore from claiming his parental rights. The words painted Lila as a helpless victim and Cade as a scheming opportunist, reducing their love to a mere legal maneuver. She felt Cade's hand tighten on hers, but his expression remained calm as Brennan continued his attack. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Rawlins and Miss Mercer were living in immoral circumstances for months prior to their hasty wedding ceremony. Dr. Morrison will testify that he observed clear signs of intimate relations between the defendants, making their marriage nothing more than an attempt to legitimize sinful behavior." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this accusation, and Lila felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The lies came so easily to these men, wrapped in legal language that made slander sound like justice. "Mr. Whitmore seeks custody of his unborn child and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the defendant's deceptive actions," Brennan concluded. "We ask this court to declare the marriage void and restore my client's rightful position as father to the child in question." Judge Carmichael nodded gravely and turned to the defense table where Cade and Lila sat with the young lawyer they had managed to engage from a neighboring town. Samuel Crawford was barely out of law school, but he had the passionate idealism of youth and a genuine belief in justice that more experienced attorneys might have lost. "Mr. Crawford, you may present your defense." Crawford stood, his nervous energy evident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case represents nothing more than the desperate attempt of a man who abandoned his responsibilities to reclaim what he discarded when it became inconvenient. Whitmore left Miss Mercer to face shame and hardship alone. Mr. Rawlins offered her protection, respect, and eventually his name in marriage union entered into freely and with genuine affection. The young lawyer's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his argument. "The marriage certificate is valid, properly executed by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls. Mrs. Rawlins will testify that she entered the union willingly, motivated by love rather than legal convenience. This court should not reward abandonment by punishing the good man who stepped forward when Mr. Whitmore failed in his duties." As Crawford spoke, Lila noticed movement near the back of the courtroom. Her father had entered quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention from those who recognized him. Reverend Isaiah Mercer walked slowly down the center aisle, his face grave as he took a seat in the front row. The sight of him sent a chill through her. Had he come to support Thomas's claims? To publicly disown her before the entire community? Judge Carmichael called for the first witness, and Dr. Morrison took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Brennan's questioning, he testified about his visits to the ranch, carefully implying impropriety without making direct accusations that could be easily challenged. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Morrison," Brennan asked, "did Mrs. Rawlins appear to be a woman who had entered marriage freely, or one who might have been coerced by circumstances?" Before Dr. Morrison could answer, the courthouse bell began to toll, not the regular hourly chime, but the urgent rhythm used to call the community together in times of crisis. The sound seemed to echo through the building like a divine judgment, demanding attention and bearing witness to the truth about to be revealed. Dr. Morrison's testimony faltered as the bell continued its urgent tolling, and Judge Carmichael frowned at the interruption. But before he could call for order, Lila felt a familiar tightening in her belly, different from the usual discomfort, sharper and more insistent. She gripped Cade's hand, her face going pale as understanding dawned. "The baby," she whispered, and the words seemed to carry through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Cade's chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood immediately, his protective instincts overriding all legal protocols. "Your Honor, my wife needs medical attention." "Now see here," Thomas protested, rising from his seat with obvious irritation. "This is clearly a ploy to avoid." His words were cut short as Lila doubled over with a sharp cry, her hand pressed to her belly as another contraction seized her. The reality of the situation became immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom, and the legal proceedings suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the drama of impending birth. Dr. Morrison abandoned the witness stand without being dismissed, his professional instincts taking precedence over legal formalities. "We need to get her somewhere she can lie down," he said, moving quickly to Lila's side. "This baby's not waiting for your hearing to conclude." "She can't leave," Attorney Brennan insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The court must resolve this matter before." "The court," Judge Carmichael interrupted with surprising firmness, "will not interfere with the birth of a child. This hearing is suspended until further notice." As Cade swept Lila into his arms with gentle strength, preparing to carry her from the courthouse, an unexpected voice rose from the front row. "Wait." Reverend Isaiah Mercer stood slowly, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Before you go, there are things that must be said, things this court needs to hear." Thomas turned eagerly toward the preacher, clearly expecting support for his cause. "Reverend Mercer, thank you for coming. I'm sure you'll help this court understand the true nature of—" "Be silent," Isaiah commanded with the authority that had silenced congregations for decades. "You forfeited any right to speak about my daughter when you abandoned her in her hour of need." The courthouse fell into absolute stillness, everyone straining to hear what the preacher would say next. Another contraction gripped Lila, but she managed to remain conscious as her father approached the bench. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection, "I have come here today not to support Mr. Whitmore's claims, but to confess my own sins before this community and before God." He turned to face the packed courtroom, his eyes finding Lila's for the first time in months. "I stand before you as a man who preached love while showing none to his own child, who spoke of forgiveness while harboring judgment in his heart, who valued his reputation more than his daughter's welfare." Thomas started to protest, but Isaiah's raised hand silenced him immediately. "When my daughter needed me most, I cast her out like refuse," the preacher continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "I gave her to Mr. Rawlins not out of concern for her welfare, but to preserve my own standing in this community. I failed as a father and as a Christian." He moved closer to where Cade held Lila, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward them both. "But Cade Rawlins succeeded where I failed. He saw my daughter's worth when I could see only my own shame. He offered her safety when I offered only judgment. He gave her love when I gave her nothing but cold duty. Another contraction seized Lila, more intense than the last, and Cade shifted her carefully in his arms. "Reverend, we need to—" "One moment more," Isaiah said urgently. "Mr. Whitmore, you speak of rights and claims, but what claim does a man have who flees when faced with responsibility? What right to fatherhood belongs to someone who leaves a woman to bear shame alone?" He turned back to the judge, his voice gaining strength. "Your Honor, I have witnessed the marriage between my daughter and Cade Rawlins these past weeks. I have seen how he cares for her, how she has flourished under his protection. This is no fraud or deception, this is love, pure and simple. The kind of love I should have shown my daughter, but was too proud to give." The simple gold wedding band on Lila's finger caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows as another contraction racked her body. She looked at her father through tears of pain and unexpected hope, seeing for the first time in months the man who had raised her rather than the cold stranger who had cast her out. "I ask this court," Isaiah concluded, his voice now thick with emotion, "to recognize what I was too blind to see, that my daughter has found not just a husband, but a true partner. That the child she carries will be raised by parents who chose each other freely and love each other deeply." Judge Carmichael looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the community members who had witnessed this unexpected testimony. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both legal authority and human compassion. "In light of the testimony presented and the immediate circumstances," he announced, "this court finds no evidence of fraud or coercion in the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Rawlins. The union is declared valid in all respects, and Mr. Whitmore's petition is denied." Thomas shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is outrageous. You can't—" "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice cutting through Thomas's protests, "this court warns Mr. Whitmore that any further harassment of the Rawlins family will result in legal consequences. Your parental claims, such as they were, ended when you abandoned your responsibilities." As if in celebration of the verdict, Lila's body announced that the baby would wait no longer. Her cry of pain mixed with relief echoed through the courthouse, and Cade didn't wait for further permission before carrying her toward the door. "Dr. Morrison," he called over his shoulder, "we'll need your help." "Right behind you," the doctor replied, gathering his medical bag with practiced efficiency. As they left the courthouse, Lila caught one last glimpse of Thomas's defeated face and her father's expression of profound regret mixed with hope for redemption. The legal battle was over, but the most important part of her journey was just beginning, the moment when she would finally hold her child in her arms, free from shame and surrounded by love. 6 hours later, as the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Elizabeth Sarah Rawlins took her first breath in the bedroom, where her mother had found refuge and love. She was perfect in every way that matter-written tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a voice that announced her arrival with indignant vigor. Dr. Morrison, who had delivered half the babies in cold mercy, declared her the healthiest infant he had seen in months. Cade held his daughter with the reverent care of a man who understood he was holding a miracle. His large, work-roughened hands looked impossibly gentle, cradling the tiny bundle, and when Elizabeth wrapped her miniature fingers around his thumb, Lila saw tears glisten in his dark eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." "She looks like you," Lila said, though she knew it was probably too early to make such determinations. What she really meant was that Elizabeth already showed signs of the quiet strength that defined the man who would raise her as his own daughter. The handmade cradle that had waited so patiently in the corner of their room finally served its purpose, lined with soft blankets that Mrs. Patterson had brought during the long afternoon of labor. Elizabeth settled into it, as if she had always belonged there, which, Lila reflected, she had. The days that followed blurred together in the sweet exhaustion that comes with new parenthood. Cade proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings without complaint and learning to change diapers with the same careful attention he brought to every task. He would stand by the cradle for long minutes just watching Elizabeth sleep, and Lila often caught him talking to her in low, gentle tones about the ranch, the animals, and the life she would grow up knowing. "She'll need to learn to ride before she can properly walk," he told Elizabeth one morning as he changed her diaper with practiced efficiency. "Can't live on a ranch without knowing horses. And we'll teach her about the garden too, how to make things grow, how to be patient with the seasons." Lila watched these interactions with a contentment so complete it sometimes took her breath away. This was what family looked like, not the cold duty she had known in her father's house, but the warm partnership she and Cade had built together. Elizabeth would grow up understanding that love was shown through daily kindnesses, through steadfast presence, through choosing to stay when staying was difficult. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, her grandfather came calling. Reverend Isaiah Mercer arrived on a Sunday afternoon, his hands twisting his hat brim as he stood awkwardly on the front porch. He looked older than Lila remembered, as if the weight of his regrets had aged him more than mere time. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "if I might meet my granddaughter." Lila and Cade exchanged glances, both remembering the cold stranger who had given her away like unwanted property. But they also remembered the broken man who had stood before the courthouse and confessed his failures to the entire community. "She's sleeping," Lila said, stepping aside to let him enter. "But you're welcome to see her." Isaiah followed them to the bedroom where Elizabeth lay in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek in the complete abandon of infant slumber. For several minutes, he simply stood there, his eyes drinking in every detail of the granddaughter he had almost lost through his own pride. "She's perfect," he whispered finally, echoing Cade's words from that first night. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Lila offered, and the hope that flickered in her father's eyes reminded her of the man who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her to fish in the creek behind the parsonage. Isaiah held Elizabeth with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was being given an undeserved gift. When she stirred and opened her eyes, fixing him with that unfocused but intense gaze that newborns possessed, his composure finally cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, the words directed at Elizabeth but meant for them all. "I'm so sorry for everything, for failing your mother when she needed me most, for valuing my pride over my daughter's welfare, for almost missing the chance to know you." "We all make mistakes, Reverend," Cade said quietly. "What matters is what we do next." What Isaiah did next was surprising in its humility. He began visiting regularly, not as the righteous preacher dispensing judgment, but as a grandfather eager to be part of his granddaughter's life. He helped with the garden harvest, shared stories of Lila's mother that brought tears and laughter in equal measure, and gradually rebuilt the relationship with his daughter that his pride had nearly destroyed. Thomas Whitmore, meanwhile, had left Cold Mercy immediately after the court hearing and had not been heard from since. Attorney Brennan had returned to Denver, presumably to find clients with more promising cases. The town itself seemed to have collectively decided that the Rawlins family deserved the same respect accorded to any other established ranch family in the valley. On a crisp October morning, when Elizabeth was 2 months old and the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides to gold, Lila stood in her wildflower garden holding her daughter. The flowers had grown beyond her wildest expectations, creating a natural meadow that attracted butterflies and birds in delightful abundance. Elizabeth seemed fascinated by the dancing butterflies, her eyes tracking their movement with the intense concentration only babies could achieve. "Look there, little one," Lila whispered, pointing to a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby stem. "Beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings." Cade emerged from the barn where he had been tending to a horse with a minor injury, and the sight of his 2 girls, surrounded by flowers, made him stop in his tracks. This was the family he had never dared hope, for the love that had grown from what others saw as punishment into something more precious than gold. "What are you thinking about?" Lila asked as he joined them in the garden. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Thinking about how sometimes the best things come when you least expect them." Elizabeth chose that moment to take her first tentative steps, wobbling between her parents with the determined concentration of someone tackling a great adventure. As she collapsed into Cade's waiting arms with a delighted giggle, Lila realized that this was what redemption looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of countless small choices to love, to stay, to build something beautiful together. The woman who had once been handed over as punishment had become the queen of her own small kingdom, ruling not through power, but through the quiet sovereignty of a life built on love, respect, and the knowledge that some gifts come disguised as burdens until we learn to see them clearly.